Resident Evil has enough abandoned versions to build a second franchise out of everything that never shipped. Some ideas became other games. Some locations disappeared in remakes. Some so-called cuts were never more than sketches, and a few returned years later wearing a different name. This is the development history behind what Capcom removed, rebuilt, censored, relocated, or wisely left in a folder. The games that vanished. Cut content in Resident Evil is not one secret folder full of finished monsters that Capcom refused to release. It includes abandoned prototypes, mechanics removed before launch, censored footage, rewritten characters, locations that vanished during remakes, and ideas moved into completely different games. The important distinction is evidence. A developer interview, surviving build, design document, or asset inside the game is evidence. A blurry forum memory from 2004 is not evidence just because somebody put dramatic music behind it. The original Resident Evil changed shape before anybody entered the finished Spencer Mansion. Early planning explored a first-person presentation and cooperative play. The project also inherited the basic idea of exploring a dangerous house from Capcom's earlier game, Sweet Home, although Resident Evil became its own story and mechanical system. Characters and scenarios changed during production, and regional versions famously censored parts of the live-action opening. That does not mean every rumor about an uncensored secret edition is real. It means the first game was already a negotiation between hardware, ratings, design ambition, and what the team could make readable on a PlayStation. Resident Evil 1.5 is the clearest example of a nearly complete direction being discarded. That unfinished version of Resident Evil 2 starred Leon Kennedy and the motorcycle racer Elza Walker rather than Claire Redfield. Its police station looked more like a modern public building. Its visual identity was colder, and its cast, enemies, clothing damage, and scenario structure differed substantially from the final game. Producer Shinji Mikami and the team concluded that it was not meeting the standard they wanted, so development was restarted. Pieces survived in altered form. Leon remained. Elza's broad role was replaced by Claire, and several concepts echoed through later designs. But 1.5 is not an alternate canon adventure that secretly happened. It is a development branch. Resident Evil 4 went through several famous branches. One early project became so stylish and action-heavy that it stopped feeling like Resident Evil and evolved into Devil May Cry. Later prototypes placed Leon inside a more overtly supernatural castle scenario. The version fans call Hookman used hallucinations, shifting environments, living dolls, and a ghostly attacker with a hook. Another concept involved a mysterious black fog. These builds were not complete games cut from the final disc. They were laboratories for tone, technology, camera work, and combat. The finished village, castle, and island inherited lessons from them without preserving their stories. The same pattern continued. Resident Evil 5 was publicly demonstrated with ideas involving harsh sunlight, heat, larger crowds, and a more isolated Chris before cooperative play, and the final Kijuju structure took priority. Resident Evil Village once gave Ada Wong a plague doctor-style role in Ethan's story, but the idea was removed because it conflicted with the finished narrative. Concept art preserves it. It does not make Ada's visit to the village canon. Remakes create a second category, material that existed in an older released game, but was not rebuilt. Resident Evil 2's remake changed the scenario system and removed creatures such as the giant moth and spiders. Resident Evil 3's remake omitted or compressed locations, including the clock tower interior, park, cemetery, and dead factory, while radically rebuilding Nemesis encounters. Those are real omissions, but they are not proof that finished modern versions were deleted at the last minute. Sometimes a remake never schedules an old area in the first place. Resident Evil 4's remake cut and redistributed material too. The main campaign appeared to remove the boss commonly called U3, but separate ways later rebuilt that idea around Ada's route. That is why timing matters when discussing cuts. Content absent on release day can return as downloadable material, while an early concept can influence a finished sequence without ever becoming canon itself. Resident Evil Requiem has already added a new example. Director Koshi Nakanishi described a discarded, almost phantom second chapter that once sat between Grace Ashcroft leaving Rhodes Hill and Leon Kennedy's mission on the outskirts. The team removed it while finalizing the game's structure. That is a documented cut. It is not permission to invent its plot. Unless Capcom releases more material, the honest answer is that the chapter existed, its placement is known, and its exact contents remain uncertain. That uncertainty is part of the fun. Cut content shows the road a game did not take, but it becomes misleading when we treat every sketch as a lost masterpiece or every remake difference as theft. So for the rest of this history, we are separating three things: what was demonstrably removed, what was deliberately changed, and what fans often remember as missing, even though it belonged to another version entirely. Raccoon City was rebuilt. The original Resident Evil 2 used fixed camera angles and tank controls. The remake replaced both with a modern, over-the-shoulder perspective and free aiming. And before you roll your eyes, hear me out, because this isn't just a graphics upgrade. This is a fundamental redesign of how the game communicates danger. That's the camera and control scheme. In 1998, the camera was locked. Pre-rendered backgrounds displayed environments from specific static angles that the developers controlled entirely. They could hide enemies just off-screen, frame jump scares with cinematic precision, and use camera placement as a difficulty tool. Tank controls reinforced the structure, making movement feel constrained and slow to respond, which amplified the psychological stress of fighting both the monsters and the interface. The 2019 remake discards this entire visual grammar. The close third-person camera lets you freely aim, move while shooting, and target specific limbs. Zombies now have fully simulated limb damage, letting you kneecap enemies to their movement or shoot arms to prevent grabs. That same fundamental zombie archetype can now absorb a dozen rounds and still get back up. Every shot becomes tense resource gambling rather than a straightforward shoot until it falls loop. But here's where it gets complicated. The original's fixed cameras restricted information deliberately. You ran toward the camera or into blind corners, never fully sure what waited on the other side of a threshold. That restriction was the point. The remake reverses this logic and replaces it with something different. Dynamic lighting and volumetric fog create a new claustrophobia. Hallways that were brightly lit in 1998 are now shrouded in darkness. Bodies that appeared inert suddenly rise. Horror becomes intimate rather than cinematic, felt in the sway of the flashlight and the proximity of grasping hands. This disagreement is concrete enough that modders have built full fixed camera systems for the remake, which tells you everything about how central this shift remains to the broader debate. But if you think camera angles are controversial, wait until you see what they did to the police station itself. The Raccoon City Police Department layout. The Raccoon City Police Department is one of the most iconic locations in survival horror history, and the Resident Evil 2 remake didn't just recreate it. It completely reimagined it from the ground up. Here's the thing. The original 1998 RPD was essentially a series of disconnected rooms stitched together by loading screens. You'd walk through a door, wait, and appear somewhere else with zero spatial continuity. It worked at the time because players accepted those limitations, but Capcom knew that in 2019, that approach wouldn't hold up, and they were right. So they rebuilt it as a fully realized, interconnected building where every room flows into the next. The main hall connects to the east wing, the west wing, the basement, the roof access, and every locked door you pass is a breadcrumb promising you can come back, and you do come back constantly. The door mechanic was completely redesigned to create tension instead of just loading new content. Doors are now obstacles that block your sight lines. You can hear what's on the other side before you commit to opening it, which turns every single doorway into a small, psychological horror moment. That's not an accident. That's deliberate environmental design working exactly as intended. The environmental storytelling in the main hall alone does more work than most horror games manage across their entire runtime. Overturned furniture, blood trails leading nowhere interesting, personal effects scattered by people who clearly had somewhere more urgent to be. Every detail is communicating something without stopping the game to explain it. And then there's the inventory system, which ties the whole experience together. Limited capacity forces you to learn the building. You're not just moving through the RPD, you're memorizing it, mentally mapping it, developing a relationship with its geography. That's what transforms a location from a backdrop into a character. Capcom turned a disconnected collection of loading screen rooms into one of the most coherent and oppressive spaces in modern gaming, which is honestly more impressive than it sounds: inventory and resource management. The remake's inventory is a grid system that feels both nostalgic and punishing at the exact same time. You rotate items like Tetris blocks to maximize space, except there's nothing fun about fitting 12 puzzle objects, 3 weapons, ammo, healing herbs, gunpowder, and wooden boards into 8 slots, while a zombie is actively chewing on your shoulder. Here's where it gets complicated. The remake removes ink ribbons as a save requirement on normal difficulty, which sounds generous until every other resource is now under exponential pressure. Zombies soak up anywhere from 3 to 15 handgun rounds, depending on RNG and shot placement, and the gunpowder crafting system forces you to decide whether you want more handgun ammo now or save materials for shotgun shells later. Every decision cascades. Take the boards to seal a window? Great, but now you can't carry the hip pouch upgrade you just found. Leave them? Cool. 8 zombies are crashing through that window when you backtrack. The psychological trick the remake pulls is making you feel resource-starved, even when the game has technically provided enough supplies to finish with ammo left over. Much of the perceived scarcity is uncertainty, an interface friction rather than true shortage. The remake weaponizes that uncertainty, and layers it with modern enemy behavior that makes every expenditure feel existential. You don't know how many lickers are ahead. You don't know if the next hallway has 3 zombies or 9. So you hoard, you ration, and you restart entire sections because you wasted 4 shotgun shells on an enemy you could have maybe avoided. Hardcore difficulty reintroduces ink ribbons and makes enemies tougher and items scarcer. Item boxes remain your only consistent relief, but because the RPD is a continuous space where Mr. X can chase you between floors, even that trip is no longer guaranteed safe. You're not just managing an inventory, you're managing risk, time, and the growing certainty that you're one bad fight away from a death spiral. But if juggling finite resources while a 7FD bioorganic weapon stalks you sounds stressful, wait until you see how the remake rewrites the police station's puzzle design. Puzzle design and key items, the original Resident Evil 2 loved throwing absurd puzzles at you. Heart-shaped keys, jewel-encrusted plugs, cogwheel contraptions that made 0 sense in a police station. The RPD was less a civic building and more a puzzle palace designed by someone who really hated logic. It was charming, sure, but also completely ridiculous if you thought about it for more than 3 seconds. The remake keeps the structure but dials back the weirdness. Instead of esoteric statue arrangements, you're operating mechanical jacks, electrical panels, combination locks, fuses, and breaker boxes. Still contrived, but at least they resemble things that could plausibly exist in a real building. Even the iconic card suit keys get a pass because the game frames the RPD as a converted museum, which explains the goddess statue with a secret passage underneath it. The remake wants you to believe this place could be real, or at least real adjacent. Here's where it gets complicated. The original let you solve puzzles in relative peace, because enemies couldn't follow through doors, and camera transitions segmented everything into discrete chunks. The remake removes that safety net entirely. Now you're inputting safe combinations while listening for Mr. X's footsteps, 2 hallways over, or aligning lock tumblers with a licker crawling somewhere above you. Puzzles themselves are often simpler than the originals, but the context makes them exponentially more stressful. It's not that the logic is harder, it's that you're solving them under constant threat. The map system helps. It marks unexplored doors, locked barriers, rooms with outstanding items, and once you inspect a key, highlights every corresponding door automatically. Some fans call this hand-holding. Others call it necessary modernization that frees you to focus on survival instead of fighting the interface. Either way, it keeps cognitive load manageable, even when the tyrant is turning your carefully planned route into a death trap. If you think one stalker complicates puzzle solving, wait until you hear about the creature mutation overhaul that makes every enemy a biomechanical nightmare you can't ignore. Creature, mutation, and gore. Here's the thing about Resident Evil 2 Remake's gore. It is not shock value. It is a gameplay mechanic dressed in viscera, and once you see it that way, you cannot unsee it. The RE Engine's damage modeling works on a zone-by-zone basis. Every zombie has discrete hit regions that respond differently depending on what you shoot and with what. Blow off an arm, and that zombie can no longer grab you from that side. Kneecap one, and it drops to a crawl, which sounds like a mercy until you realize a crawling zombie is now at ankle height and considerably harder to track through a dark corridor. The threat does not go away, just changes shape. Dismemberment is not a reward for good shooting. It is a tactical tool you are constantly being forced to make decisions about. Do you spend the ammo to remove the arm? Or do you save it and manage the grab risk manually? That calculation is happening constantly, and the gore system is what makes it legible. You need to see the damage to understand the state of the threat. Zombie resilience compounds all of this. These things do not go down clean. You pump rounds into one, it staggers, it keeps coming, and the visible deterioration of its body is your only real feedback on how close it is to finished. The gore is the health bar. There is no other way to read it. Lickers operate on a completely different logic. They are blind, but they have exceptional hearing, which flips the entire combat framework into stealth. You are no longer shooting your way through a room. You are holding your breath and hoping the thing does not hear your footsteps. The redesign in the remake leaned into this harder than the original ever did, and it works. Every single one of these systems uses the graphic content as the mechanical information. That is not gratuitous, that is just good design. Mr. X Stalker Mechanics. In the original Resident Evil 2, Mr. X was scary in short bursts. He appeared in scripted moments during the B scenarios, crashed through a wall, walked menacingly toward you, then disappeared once you moved on. His threat was contained, a spike of tension, not a constant presence. The remake throws that entire structure out. Once you push deeper into the RPD through story progression, Mr. X makes his entrance and never truly leaves. He patrols large sections of the station, tracks you by sound and line of sight, and follows you through doors. His heavy footsteps echo through walls, even when he's nowhere near you, creating a layer of dread that sits on top of every puzzle, every resource decision, every backtracking route. He does have limits. Safe rooms, the STARS office, and a handful of other specific areas are off limits to him. Break his line of sight, pass through enough rooms quickly, and he'll lose track of you. You can also temporarily stagger him with enough firepower, buying about 30 seconds to work. This creates a real choice. Burn scarce ammo to secure breathing room, or save every bullet and rely on movement. His lunging punch can be baited, giving you a short recovery window to escape. This turns every encounter into a micro-puzzle of spacing and timing, especially when he's chasing you through hallways already packed with zombies. Sprinting blindly is suicide. You have to route your objectives to minimize time in his patrol zones and treat safe rooms like tactical checkpoints. The psychological impact is massive. Simple tasks like opening a safe become nerve-shredding when you can hear his footsteps getting closer. The horror shifts from scripted jump scares to sustained, systemic dread. He's not a set piece anymore. He's a walking recalculation of every plan you make. But if you think one relentless stalker tests your nerves, wait until you see how the remake reimagines the zapping system. The zapping system reimagining. The original Resident Evil 2 had one of the most ambitious narrative structures in gaming, and the remake threw most of it away. Before you roll your eyes, hear me out. In 1998, Resident Evil 2 shipped with a zapping system that let actions in one playthrough affect the next. Kill Brad Vickers outside the RPD in your first run, he stays dead in your second. Grab the submachine gun from that special locker, Claire doesn't get it later. Burn away those crimson plant doors in the lab, they're cleared for whoever comes after. The system tracked multiple types of interactions across both campaigns, creating a story that felt like two characters moving through the same disaster from different angles. The remake replaces this with something called Second Run. It's functionally just an alternate campaign with remixed enemy placements and a different opening. Leon and Claire still explore the same areas, fight similar bosses, and resolve the outbreak in nearly identical ways. But the game doesn't track what you did before. You can fight William Birkin in Leon's campaign, then Claire fights him again in hers, and the game pretends both happen simultaneously, even though that makes zero timeline sense. No causality, no consequences, what was gained? Cleaner pacing. The remake's campaigns are tighter and more focused, and new players get a complete narrative arc whether they play Leon or Claire first. The game doesn't punish you for taking items in one run by locking you out of resources in another, but here's where it gets complicated. The original's zapping system, even with its rough edges, created something the remake can't replicate. The sense that your choices mattered beyond a single playthrough. Community discussions still argue over which scenario pair is the real canon because the structure forced you to think about how Leon and Claire connected. The remake sidesteps that entirely. Later canon pulls from both campaigns, both are also kind of not. Mass appeal storytelling that refuses to commit, at least the character beats hit harder now. Unlike the dialogue rewrites and emotional depth we're about to cover in the next section, character story beats and dialogue. Leon Kennedy was a goofy, quippy action hero in the original Resident Evil 2, except he wasn't. The remake gets accused of softening him into a wide-eyed rookie who stumbles through conversations, but in 1998 he was always a wide-eyed rookie who stumbled through conversations. The difference is that the original's stiff voice acting made him sound accidentally confident when he was supposed to be terrified. The remake just lets you hear the terror. Claire gets similar treatment. She's more protective, more grounded, and spends significantly more time bonding with Sherry Birkin than she did in the original. Where the 1998 version had her mostly reacting to plot beats, the remake positions her as Sherry's primary emotional anchor throughout the entire campaign. The dialogue between them feels less like non-player character delivers exposition, and more like an older sister trying to keep a traumatized child calm while zombies kick down doors. Marvin Branagh goes from a guy who shows up wounded and dies 5 minutes later to the emotional core of the RPD's collapse. The remake frames him as the de facto leader who helped civilians escape and stayed behind, knowing he was infected. When you inevitably encounter his zombified form later, it hurts instead of feeling like a gameplay obstacle wearing a familiar face. The villains get sharper too. Chief Irons becomes a direct, immediate threat to Sherry rather than a lore villain you only read about in files. Annette Birkin is no longer a stock mad scientist, but a tragic figure torn between motherhood and her complicity in Umbrella's atrocities. The remake also cuts most of the long, stilted exposition monologues the original relied on, trusting players to piece together the outbreak through environmental storytelling instead. The result is dialogue that prioritizes emotion over explanation, which makes the horror feel personal. But if you think modernizing Leon into an anxious rookie who visibly panics is a betrayal of his character, wait until you remember he spends half of Resident Evil 4 getting his face kicked in by villagers while screaming for help. The fourth survivor in Tofu mode. The original Resident Evil 2 didn't just end when you finished Leon and Claire's stories, it rewarded dedicated players with the fourth survivor, a brutal bonus mode where you control Hunk, an Umbrella operative who finds himself stranded in the sewers with a G-Virus sample and has to fight his way to the RPD helipad before the city is destroyed. No exploration, no puzzles, just a gauntlet of enemies with limited supplies and zero margin for error. And because Hunk escapes with a G-Virus sample, this mode confirms that Umbrella's recovery operation succeeded. It's not a silly side game, it's lore. And then there's Tofu, a giant block of tofu armed only with knives, forced to run the exact same escape route as Hunk. It's a parody mode that somehow became more iconic than most serious unlockables, because surviving Raccoon City as sentient bean curd is objectively funny and objectively horrifying in equal measure. The remake brings both modes back and makes them more punishing. Hunk's route is structurally the same, but the RE engine's tougher enemies and over-the-shoulder aiming turn it into a masterclass in precision. Every bullet counts. Every zombie you don't kill becomes a problem 30 seconds later. It's the purest distillation of the remake's mechanics, stripped of narrative safety nets. Tofu returns with multiple variants, each with different loadouts. Default Tofu still only gets knives, which now degrade with use. Other variants specialize in grenades or specific firearms, turning the mode into a suite of ultra-hard scenarios that force you to master one mechanic under the worst possible conditions. They still wobble. They still make weird noises. The absurdity is the point. These modes matter because they validate everything the remake changes. The camera, the tougher enemies, the resource economy, all of it gets stress-tested in high-stakes runs where one wrong move ends you. They're not just fan service. They're the final exam. Spain lost entire pieces. In 2005, Leon's knife was basically a box cutter. You pulled it out to break crates, maybe finish off a downed Ganado, and that was it. Zero defensive capability, zero upgrades, infinite durability because it barely mattered enough to need a limit. The remake turned that thing into the backbone of your entire defensive toolkit. There's now a dedicated parry that lets you intercept Ganado swings, crossbow bolts, and here's the kicker, chainsaw attacks. In the original, Dr. Salvador touches you with that chainsaw, and you're watching a death animation. No counterplay. In the remake, a perfectly timed parry deflects even that, which is, not ideal for the chainsaw's self-esteem, but fantastic for yours. The trade-off is durability. Every parry, every slash, every stealth takedown drains a visible durability bar. When it breaks, you're scrounging for disposable knives or paying the merchant for repairs. That parry that saved your life, it's going to cost you pesetas later. The knife is also fully upgradable now across power and durability tiers. The original gave you 0 knife upgrades. 0. Then there's stealth. The original had none. You walked into a room and everything aggroed. The remake lets Leon crouch and perform instant stealth takedowns on unaware enemies, adding a whole pre-combat phase that simply didn't exist before. Most arenas still escalate into open combat no matter what. So, stealth thins the herd rather than replacing the fight. But if you think a new knife is a big deal, wait until you see what they did to Leon's legs. Movement and combat mobility. This is the change that everything else is built on. In the original Resident Evil 4, Leon had to stop moving to aim his weapon. Full stop. You planted your feet, raised the gun, and hoped nothing was already too close. The remake throws that entire philosophy out and gives you full modern third-person shooter controls. Strafing, backpedaling, aiming while moving, it feels like a completely different game, because mechanically, it is. But here's the thing. Capcom didn't just hand players more freedom and call it a day. They rebuilt enemy behavior from the ground up to match. Ganados flank more aggressively, projectiles are tuned to hit moving targets, and if you think you can just hold backward on the stick and shoot forever, the game will punish you for it. There's also a dedicated crouch button now, which does triple duty, stealth movement, ducking under attacks, and changing Leon's silhouette behind cover. None of this existed in 2005, and a huge chunk of the old QTE dodge prompts gone, replaced by actual player-driven movement, crouch evasion, and parry timing. You're in control during the moments that matter, not mashing a button prompt during a cutscene. Even basic traversal got an overhaul, vaulting, jumping through windows, climbing ladders, all faster and smoother. And enemies follow you more aggressively now, so climbing a ladder isn't the free vacation it used to be. The village siege is where you really feel it. More kiting routes, vertical escapes, constant repositioning under pressure instead of backing into a corner and praying. But if you think a crouch button and some smoother movement are the biggest upgrades to Leon's toolkit, wait until you see what they did with the Merchant. The Merchant and request system in the original Resident Evil 4, the Merchant was simple. You walked up, you bought guns, you upgraded guns, you sold treasures, you left. He had maybe 6 lines of dialogue and 0 expectations of you beyond having enough pesetas. Mechanically, he was a vending machine with a trench coat, a beloved vending machine, but a vending machine nonetheless. The remake turns him into something closer to an informal quest giver, and it does this without breaking his mystique even a little. Blue notes now appear pinned throughout the environments, each one a request from the merchant himself. Destroy a set of blue medallions, hunt down a specific mini-boss creature lurking off the main path, retrieve a rare item from an area you'd normally sprint past. They're all optional, technically. Here's where it gets interesting. Completing these requests doesn't pay out in pesetas, it pays out in spinels. Now, in the 2005 game, spinels were just shiny rocks you sold for cash. That's it. The remake repurposes them into an entirely separate currency that buys things pesetas literally cannot. Exclusive upgrade tickets, treasure maps, rare weapon attachments, so now you've got a dual economy running underneath every chapter. Pesetas handle your standard upgrades, spinels gate the genuinely powerful stuff. Ignore the requests and you're leaving real permanent power on the table. But the merchant wasn't done renovating. The shooting gallery comes back too, except now it has multiple stages, harder difficulty tracks, and a gacha-style charm system. You play, you win little charms, you slap them onto your attaché case, and they give you passive bonuses. Increased healing from green herbs, merchant discounts, better crafting yields. It's a full meta progression layer hidden inside a carnival minigame. Some players love this. Others argue the requests pull your attention sideways when the original's greatest strength was its relentless forward momentum. And honestly, both camps have a point, but at least the merchant gives you a choice. Ashley, on the other hand, doesn't give you one at all. Ashley Graham's AI and interaction. Let's just say it. In the original Resident Evil 4, Ashley Graham was the worst part of the game. Not because she was a bad character, not because the story didn't need her, but because her AI had the survival instincts of a blindfolded toddler wandering through traffic. She'd walk directly into your line of fire. She'd stand perfectly still while a ganado sprinted at her with an axe. She grabbed off screen and carried halfway across the map before you even realized she was gone. Every single encounter with Ashley present was less about fighting enemies and more about babysitting someone who seemed actively committed to dying. Players spent entire sections not thinking, how do I survive this, but how do I survive this, while also preventing this woman from standing on top of a bear trap. The remake fixes basically all of it, and it's not subtle about it. Ashley now ducks during firefights. She stays behind Leon. She crouches when enemies get close and actively moves away from danger instead of toward it. You can tell her to stay tight or hang back with a single button press, no menu required. She no longer has a traditional health bar. Instead, she goes into a down state when she takes too much damage, and Leon has to run over and pick her up. No more burning through your herb supply keeping her alive. No more instant game overs because a stray shotgun pellet clipped her from across the room. But here's where it gets complicated. That old frustration? It was also tension. Terrible, unfair, controller snapping tension, but tension nonetheless. The original made you genuinely panicked about Ashley's safety because she could die at any moment for basically no reason. The remake replaces that raw panic with something smarter, building dread through level design and enemy placement instead of AI incompetence. It works better, but keeping Ashley alive is only one half of the survival equation. The other half is what you're carrying in that briefcase, and the remake changed that system from the ground up. Inventory and attaché case management. Nobody talks about this one, and that's weird because it quietly changes everything about how Resident Evil 4 actually works. In the original, resources were resources. You found handgun ammo, you had handgun ammo. You picked up a green herb, you had a green herb. Zero ambiguity. The entire resource loop was walk into room, pick up thing, put thing in case, use thing when needed. The only decision was whether you had enough room in your attaché case to carry it all. The remake throws that whole model out. Now you're picking up gunpowder and raw resources that don't do anything on their own. You have to combine them. And here's the thing. Different combinations produce different results. The same gunpowder that could become shotgun shells could also become handgun rounds or crossbow bolts. Every single pickup is now a question. Not do I have room for this, but what do I turn this into? That sounds small. It is not small. What Capcom actually did is introduce anticipation as a core skill. A player who knows the castle courtyard is coming and crafts shotgun shells in advance is playing a fundamentally different game than someone who panic crafts pistol ammo mid-fight. The original never asked you to think ahead like that. And on higher difficulties, crafting yields drop. The same resources that gave you 15 rounds on standard might give you 10 on professional. So the decision isn't just what to craft, it's when. Then layer the knife repair economy on top. Repairing your knife costs pesetas. Upgrading weapons costs pesetas. Every system feeds from the same resource pool, which means crafting decisions bleed into upgrades, which bleed into knife maintenance, which bleed into how aggressively you parry, which bleed into how much ammo you burn. It's all one loop. The original was a shooter where you managed a briefcase. The remake is a resource management game where shooting happens to be how you spend most of your resources, but the resource loop only tells you so much about how the remake actually feels different. For that, you have to look at the story the game is telling and the people carrying it. Narrative tone and character arcs. The original Resident Evil 4 knew exactly what it was. Leon walked into a village full of parasite-infected cultists and responded with the energy of a guy who'd already seen worse and found it mildly inconvenient. Salazar chewed scenery like it was a competitive sport. Sadler monologued with the conviction of a man who genuinely believed his own PowerPoint presentation. The whole thing worked because the game never once pretended it wasn't a B-movie dressed up in survival horror clothing. It was camp, it was intentional, and people loved it for exactly that reason. The remake throws most of that out the window. Leon in 2023 is a fundamentally different character. He's still sarcastic, still capable, but the jokes come less often and land heavier. Raccoon City isn't just backstory anymore, it's something he visibly carries. His banter with Ashley and Luis still exists, but it reads more like coping mechanism than action hero swagger. And Luis Serra is where the remake makes its strongest case. In the original, Luis was charming, showed up a handful of times, and then died. That was basically it. The remake gives him an entire arc. His history with the Plagas research, his guilt over what he helped create, his relationship with Leon, all of it gets real screen time. By the time his story reaches its conclusion, it actually hits. The original implied tragedy. The remake earns it. Salazar and Sadler get the opposite treatment from what you'd expect. Instead of being louder, they're quieter. Salazar trades theatrical tantrums for something colder. Sadler drops the cartoon villain energy for genuine cult leader conviction, which is honestly worse. Here's the thing nobody wants to admit. The original's tone probably couldn't survive a straight recreation in 2023. A shot-for-shot remake of Leon's cheesiest lines with modern production values would feel bizarre. But the loss of that camp is real, and some fans will never forgive the trade. Whether grounded horror was the right call depends entirely on what you loved about the original in the first place. But if the story rewrites changed how the game feels, the level design changes how it plays. And that's a whole different conversation. Village and castle and environmental design. The original Resident Evil 4 was a straight line, a beautiful, perfectly paced, relentlessly forward-moving straight line, but a straight line nonetheless. You walked into an area, killed everything, moved to the next area. Almost zero reason to backtrack, almost zero optional content, and the environment existed to funnel you from cutscene to cutscene like cattle through a chute. In 2005, nobody complained because that's just how games were built. The remake throws that entire philosophy out a window. The village region alone is basically unrecognizable. What used to be corridors connecting combat arenas is now a semi-open zone with interconnected sub-areas, optional buildings, destructible environments, and hidden resources tucked into corners. The critical path never asks you to visit. You can spend 20 minutes poking around houses and side paths before touching the main objective. And here's the thing, the game rewards you for it. Crafting materials, weapon components, treasures, all distributed based on how thoroughly you explore. Players who sprint through get the bare minimum. Players who investigate every suspicious door walk out with a meaningfully better loadout. The lake area gets expanded with more boat traversal and additional encounters. The castle sections are rebuilt with more complex geometry, more flanking routes, more verticality, and the island, comfortably the most criticized stretch of the original, is restructured almost entirely. Less repetitive military corridor shooting, more variety, but the wider change is the environmental storytelling. Notes on tables, observable details in the architecture, set dressing that tells you what happened to this village without a single cutscene. The cult's history is baked into the walls. You don't get told this story, you walk through it. The trade-off is obvious. The original's linearity was its momentum engine. Every second pushed you forward. The remake deliberately slows that down to let you breathe, and whether that's richer immersion or a loss of drive depends entirely on the player. But if you think redesigning entire zones is ambitious, wait until you see what they did to the bosses. Boss battle revisions. The original Resident Evil 4 had boss fights that hit like a truck the first time you saw them. Massive creatures, dramatic camera angles, QTE prompts flashing on screen while something enormous tried to eat you. And honestly, it worked, but it worked exactly once. Because once you knew the gimmick, those fights had the replay depth of a loading screen. The remake fixes this by doing something deceptively simple. It makes you actually fight the bosses. El Gigante is a perfect example. In 2005, you shoot it until it kneels, climb on its back, mash a button, repeat. In the remake, it has a genuine move set. It tracks your movement, punishes predictable kiting, and its attacks have dodge windows tied to your actual inputs, rather than a prompt that pops up like a polite suggestion. You're reading the fight that didn't exist before. Krauser is where the difference is most visible. The original fight was iconic and also about 90% quick time event. The remake strips all of that out and replaces it with a proper knife duel. So parry windows, multi-phase escalation, real consequences for mistiming. It's the single best argument the remake makes for its new combat philosophy. Standard enemies got the same treatment. Ganados aren't just more aggressive, they're smarter. They flank, they coordinate. You thin the crowd and the survivors actually adjust their approach rather than shuffling forward like nothing happened. And the regenerators. In 2005, they were scary because you didn't know what they were. In the remake, they're scary because you do. The breathing, the way the music shifts when one is nearby. Their threat is built on sensory dread rather than a single surprise, which means they're terrifying on your first encounter and your fifth. Some of the original's charm is lost in translation. Absurdity has its own value, but what you get in exchange is fights worth replaying, worth mastering, worth failing at 3 times, because the 4th attempt feels earned. And if reworking every major fight sounds like a full overhaul, it is. But Capcom didn't stop there. The remake was always missing one story, and they finally told it. The Separate Ways integration. In the original Resident Evil 4, Separate Ways wasn't part of the initial GameCube release. It showed up later in the PlayStation 2 version, a fully playable second campaign following Ada Wong through the same events as Leon's, told from her side. It explained what Ada was actually doing while Leon was being grabbed, shot, and thrown into various dungeons. It worked as a bonus mode, a satisfying one, but still a bonus. The remake turns it into paid DLC, released in September 2023, and the first thing it makes clear is that Ada is not Leon. She has a grappling hook that opens traversal options the entire main campaign never had. She moves through familiar areas, but accesses them differently using geometry that Leon walked past entirely. The same village, castle, and island look different when you're coming at them from entirely new angles. The story weight is where the DLC changes the most. In the original, Ada's motivations were kept deliberately vague. She wanted the Plagas sample. She worked for Wesker, and that was basically the full explanation. The remake expands her arc considerably. Wesker reads as more manipulative, more dangerous, and the dynamic between them reframes what was happening in the background of the main campaign the whole time. Luis Serra's arc, already extended in Leon's campaign, gets further development here too. New boss encounters are built around Ada's moveset specifically, which means the combat system gets tested in configurations Leon's campaign never sets up. Her weapons, her upgrade paths, her whole approach to the same enemies you've already fought sits just differently enough to make Separate Ways feel like a parallel game, not a remix. The original Separate Ways was a few hours of bonus content. The remake version runs significantly longer and carries actual narrative weight. You come away from it understanding things about why certain events unfolded the way they did, things Leon never finds out. The ending hits differently when you know what was happening off-screen the entire time. Some cuts broke things. Resident Evil doesn't know what it wants to be, and honestly, it hasn't known for over 2 decades now. The original trilogy was built on a simple premise. You are weak, the world is dangerous, and every bullet matters. Fixed camera angles meant you couldn't see what was around the corner. Tank controls meant you couldn't just sprint away from danger. The games were designed to make you feel trapped. Then Resident Evil 4 happened. Shinji Mikami didn't tweak the formula, he burned it to the ground. 4 separate versions were scrapped before he landed on the over-the-shoulder camera that would redefine third-person shooters entirely. And it worked. Resident Evil 4 is one of the most celebrated games ever made, but it opened a door that Capcom couldn't close. Resident Evil 5 cranked up the action, co-op gameplay, daylight firefights, Chris Redfield going from traumatized survivor to military action figure. Resident Evil 6 made it worse, splitting into 3 campaigns that tried to be everything to everyone, quick time events everywhere, vehicle chases. You could barely call it horror anymore. So, when Resident Evil 7 dropped in, first person with a creaky plantation and 0 bombastic set pieces, fans collectively exhaled. But that game still had to exist in the same universe where Chris punches boulders and Leon Roundhouse kicks cultists. The tonal whiplash isn't just between eras, it's baked into the franchise's DNA now. The community is permanently split. One camp wants tank controls back, another thinks 4 perfected the balance, a third just wants the atmospheric dread of 7. Capcom has to serve all 3, which means every new release is less of a game announcement and more of a declaration of war. But if the identity crisis is the franchise's biggest philosophical problem, then the thing that makes its lore physically painful to follow is somehow even messier. The overcomplicated virus mutation logic. Resident Evil's virus lore starts off elegantly with the progenitor virus, the foundation of Umbrella's viral research. This pathogen can affect an unusually broad range of plants and animals, making it the perfect in-universe explanation for the series' nightmarish creatures. Umbrella's early experiments focused on taming and mutating this base virus, leading to the infamous T-virus created by James Marcus, which kickstarted the disasters that define the franchise. But here's where it spirals into a convoluted mess. Umbrella didn't stop at the T-virus. Over the decades, but countless variants popped up. T. veronica, the G-virus, Ouroboros, the C-virus, and fungal strains like the Mutamycete. Each new strain was introduced to justify new enemy types and plot twists, drifting further from the neat, unified origin the progenitor virus promised. The result? Mutation logic that ranges wildly from reanimated zombies to hyper-intelligent bioweapons capable of strategic combat without any clear biological consistency. Why do some viruses turn victims into shambling, brain-dead zombies, while others produce monsters who can use weapons, communicate, and even lead armies? Why do outbreaks sometimes explode uncontrollably, but other times remain suspiciously contained? The virus rules keep changing based on what's convenient for the story. This sprawling viral ecosystem works as a flexible storytelling tool. Capcom can throw in whatever new menace they want under the umbrella of virus mutation, but it also erodes narrative stakes and frustrates fans who crave consistent infection mechanics. Some appreciate the rich virus taxonomy and all the unique horror themes it enables, while others dismiss it as a confusing tangle of contradictions that breaks immersion. Resident Evil's virus mutation logic embodies a core franchise tension, an elegant origin concept undermined by an ever-expanding contradictory monster menagerie. And if you thought viruses getting out of hand was messy, just wait till we talk about the gameplay mechanic that still has fans divided after all these years. The stationary shooting mechanic legacy. You cannot move and shoot at the same time in classic Resident Evil. That's not a bug. That's not a hardware limitation. That is the entire point. When Capcom designed the original Resident Evil in 1996, they made a deliberate choice. The moment you raise your weapon, your feet are glued to the floor. You aim, you fight, and you pray that whatever shambling toward you drops before it reaches biting distance. Combined with fixed camera angles and tank controls, every zombie encounter felt like a life or death gamble. You weren't an action hero. You were a person with a gun who had to stop everything just to use it. And here's the thing. It worked beautifully. You couldn't kite enemies. You couldn't circle strafe around a licker. You had to commit, turn, plant, aim, shoot, and accept that during those 2 seconds of animation, anything could close the gap. The tension wasn't just about ammo scarcity. It was about the fact that defending yourself required you to become a sitting duck. When Resident Evil 4 overhauled everything to over-the-shoulder in 2005, Capcom still kept stationary shooting. Leon could aim with precision, pivot freely, but the second that laser sight came up, his boots might as well have been nailed to the floor. Which is, not ideal when a chainsaw guy is sprinting at your face. The community is split clean down the middle. Old school players will tell you stationary shooting as Resident Evil, that the restriction forces genuine panic when you miscount your shots. Newer players see a relic that belongs in a museum next to memory cards and CRT televisions. But here's where it gets complicated. Modern horror games have largely abandoned this approach, and many of them struggle to recreate the specific dread those old games generated so effortlessly. Turns out when you can sprint and hip fire simultaneously, something subtle gets lost. But if a control scheme debate sounds tame, wait until we talk about the moment Resident Evil went completely off the rails tonally. And yes, it involves punching a boulder. The boulder punching tonal shift. Chris Redfield punches a boulder, a literal geological boulder in a volcano, and the game expects you to help him do it by mashing buttons. I don't know what to tell you. This single QuickTime event in Resident Evil 5 has become the unofficial mascot of everything that went wrong with the franchise's mid-series identity. Not because it's the only ridiculous moment, but because it perfectly crystallizes the gap between what Resident Evil used to be and what it had become by 2009. Here's the thing. In 1996, Chris Redfield was a STARS officer who could barely survive a mansion full of slow-moving zombies. He had limited ammo, a knife that was basically decorative, and the physical presence of a guy who maybe went to the gym 3 times a week, Fast forward 13 years, and this same character is built like a refrigerator with arms, squaring up against a rock formation like it personally insulted his family. The progression from vulnerable man with a handgun to geology's worst nightmare happened gradually enough that each step seemed reasonable. Zoom out, and the trajectory is genuinely insane, and the community knows it. The Boulder Punch has lived rent-free in Resident Evil discourse for over 15 years. Roger Craig Smith, who voiced Chris in later entries, has openly leaned into the meme. TikTok compilations still circulate the clip. Fans treat it with this weird mixture of genuine affection and pointed critique, which is honestly the only appropriate response to watching a survival horror protagonist fist fight the Earth's crust. But beneath the laughter, there's a real problem. When your protagonist can physically overpower terrain, you've lost something fundamental. Horror requires vulnerability. It requires the audience to believe the character could die. Chris punching that boulder told the audience on a subconscious level that nothing in this world could actually threaten him, which is, not ideal for a horror franchise. But if you think a protagonist punching rocks is a problem, wait until you hear about the characters Capcom punched right out of the storyline entirely. The abandoned plot threads and missing characters. Rebecca Chambers is either one of the most compelling characters in Resident Evil, or the franchise's most neglected asset. Either way, she's been sidelined from the mainline games for over 20 years, and it took a pair of CG movies for Capcom to remember she exists. Here's the thing. Rebecca debuted as an 18-year-old STARS medic in the original game, starred in Resident Evil 0, survived insect and animal bowels that would traumatize most people into permanent retirement, and then just vanished from the games. No numbered sequel, no arc, no closure in the mainline series. She did resurface as a major character in the CG films Resident Evil, Vendetta 2017 and Resident Evil, Death Island 2023, reuniting with Chris, Jill, Leon, and Claire. But that only underlines the point. The character clearly still has story potential, yet Capcom keeps parking her outside the games that actually define the canon for most fans. And she's not alone. The Outbreak series introduced an entire roster of civilian survivors with real depth. Alyssa Ashcroft, for example, had genuine story potential that went absolutely nowhere in the mainline canon. These characters existed, mattered within their games, and then Capcom moved on like they never happened. Cool, add that to the list. The pattern is always the same. Capcom introduces compelling side characters, builds fan attachment, then funnels all narrative resources back into the same 3 or 4 leads. Chris, Leon, Jill, occasionally Claire. Everyone else gets a filing cabinet in the basement labeled maybe later, except later never comes. What makes this worse is the fragmentation it creates. You've got unresolved corporate conspiracies, survivor communities from Raccoon City that were never revisited, and bioterror organizations introduced in one game only to be quietly forgotten by the next. The universe feels less like a cohesive world and more like a collection of disconnected episodes that share a logo. Fans notice. They've been vocal about it for years. Community posts still circulate asking when Rebecca comes back. Fan projects literally invent descendants of forgotten characters, just to give those storylines some form of continuation. When your audience is doing your narrative homework for you, that's not dedication, that's a red flag. The result is a franchise with enormous storytelling potential that consistently refuses to use it. Every abandoned thread is a missed opportunity to deepen the world, reward long-term fans, and make the universe feel like it actually remembers itself. But if forgotten characters frustrate you, wait until we talk about a system that's been frustrating players since 1996, except this one involves your entire inventory. Inventory management friction. Here's something nobody ever talks about when they praise Resident Evil's horror. Half the tension in those games didn't come from zombies. It came from staring at 8 inventory slots and realizing you physically cannot carry everything you need to survive. The original games gave you almost nothing, 6 to 8 slots depending on the title, and every single one mattered. You want that shotgun? That's a slot. Ammo? Another slot. A healing herb? Gone. And now you're standing in front of a key item you need to progress, doing mental arithmetic like you're filing taxes in a war zone. But here's the thing. That friction wasn't a flaw. It was the entire point. Every trip back to an item box was a decision. Every hallway you crossed to swap gear was another chance to get ambushed. The inventory wasn't separate from the horror. It was the horror. Then Resident Evil 4 turned the whole thing into a spatial puzzle. The attaché case gave you a grid, and every weapon, every egg, every fish you inexplicably decided to keep had a physical shape that needed to fit. Players spent genuine minutes rotating a rifle to squeeze in one more box of handgun rounds, and you couldn't drop items, no storage boxes. Whatever you discarded was gone permanently. That decision to throw away a flash grenade for a new scope, real consequence baked into a menu screen, fans genuinely love this. Community posts describe organizing the attaché case as its own minigame, something satisfying and tactical that made every resource feel meaningful, which is, not ideal for Capcom's later design philosophy, because later titles simplified everything. Bigger inventories, more generous drops, less spatial reasoning. And from a pure convenience standpoint, sure, nobody's crying over fewer trips to storage, but a vocal chunk of the fan base argues something essential was lost. When your inventory stops being a constraint, it stops being a source of tension. And when tension leaves resource management, you're one step closer to just being a shooter with zombies in it. But if you think agonizing over inventory space is bad for tension, wait until you realize the games have an even bigger problem with stakes. Specifically, the complete lack of them for anyone whose name is on the box art. The main protagonist armor and lack of stakes. Chris Redfield has been punched through walls, thrown off buildings, exposed to multiple bioorganic weapons, caught in explosions, and stood next to an active volcano. He's fine. Leon Kennedy has been impaled, infected, beaten unconscious by creatures that could level a city block, and dropped from heights that would turn a normal person into abstract art. Also fine. Jill Valentine was literally mind-controlled by Wesker for years, while pumped full of experimental chemicals. She came back looking great, actually. Here's the thing. Resident Evil calls itself survival horror, but the survival part only applies to people who aren't on the box art. Plot armor in this franchise isn't subtle. It's not even trying to hide. The main characters exist in a state of permanent narrative immunity where lethal threats become inconveniences and catastrophic injuries heal between cutscenes. And look, every long-running franchise protects its leads to some degree. That's just storytelling. But Resident Evil does it while simultaneously killing side characters in horrific ways to prove how dangerous the situation is. The random BSAA soldier gets dissolved by acid in seconds. Chris, standing 3 FT away, takes the same hit and shakes it off like a bee sting. This creates a stakes problem that compounds with every entry. When you've watched Leon survive his 15th impossible scenario, the 16th one doesn't hit the same. Your brain stops processing. Will he make it? Because the answer is always yes. Always. Without exception. The tension evaporates because you're not watching a person in danger. You're watching a mascot fulfilling contractual obligations. And it's not just physical survival. These characters rarely carry meaningful psychological weight between games either. Chris gets a bit broody in Resident Evil 6, sure. But by the next appearance he's essentially reset. Nobody's permanently scarred, nobody's diminished, nobody retires because their body physically can't do this anymore. They just show up again, slightly buffer, ready for another round. The community has talked about this extensively, and the criticism usually boils down to one question. How can a game be scary when the person you're controlling is functionally immortal? Secondary characters die to establish threat. Main characters survive to sell sequels. That imbalance isn't a bug in the system. It is the system, which is, not ideal for a horror franchise. But if protagonist invincibility is a storytelling problem, Capcom's multiplayer experiments are an entirely different kind of failure. The modern live service and multiplayer failures. Capcom has been trying to make Resident Evil work as a multiplayer franchise for years now, and every single time, it falls flat on its face. Umbrella Corps, Resident Evil Resistance, RE-verse. 3 swings, 3 misses, and somehow they keep stepping up to the plate like this time it'll be different. Here's the thing. Resident Evil works because of isolation, because of atmosphere, because you're alone in a building full of things that want to eat you. The second you throw 4 other players into that equation, all of that evaporates. You can't be scared when your teammate is teabagging a zombie corpse in the corner. Umbrella Corps tried to turn the franchise into a competitive tactical shooter, which is a bit like turning a haunted house into a laser tag arena. The mechanics were generic. The connection to anything people loved about Resident Evil was surface level at best. and the player base vanished almost immediately. Then came Resistance, bundled with the Resident Evil 3 remake like a party favor nobody asked for. An asymmetrical multiplayer mode where one player controls the mastermind while survivors try to escape. Cool concept on paper. In practice, the average concurrent player count on Steam sits around 47. 47. For a mode attached to one of the biggest horror franchises on the planet. That's not a community. That's a book club. Resistance continued the pattern. Another multiplayer experiment. Another lukewarm reception. Another mode that felt bolted onto a franchise that never needed it. The community has been saying the same thing for years. Stop trying to make multiplayer happen. It's not going to happen, and the skepticism makes sense. Every hour spent on a multiplayer mode that'll be dead within 6 months is an hour that could have gone toward campaign content, toward story, toward the things people actually buy these games for. Survival horror is built to be unfair, oppressive, to make you feel like the game is actively working against you. That's the opposite of what keeps people grinding ranked matches at 2 a.m. The question isn't whether these experiments failed. They objectively did. The question is whether Capcom will finally stop trying to force a square peg into a round hole. Because if there's one thing worse than a failed multiplayer mode, it's a timeline that can't decide what actually happened, which is exactly where we're headed next. The timeline. Splintering and remake canon confusion. Here's the thing about being a Resident Evil fan in 2026. Almost half the experience is just figuring out what's actually canon. Not what happens in the games, but what's supposed to be real within the story. Because nobody can give you a straight answer anymore. Let me explain. The original Resident Evil 2 had this zapping system, where you could play as Leon or Claire first, and your choice changed what happened in the other character's scenario. Items shifted around. Events changed. Fans often treat Claire A and Leon B as the cleanest route, but later canon blends details from both campaigns. Most players just picked whoever looked cooler and moved on, spinning off into their own wrong timelines without knowing it. That was manageable. Then the remakes came along. The Resident Evil 2 remake reimagines everything. Locations, character interactions, even major plot points. Now there are 2 versions of the same story, both official, both definitive. Nobody confirms if the remake replaces the original, or if they coexist, or if this is some kind of reboot. I don't know what to tell you. But wait, it gets messier. These contradictions aren't just big picture stuff. Resident Evil 4, for example, establishes Leon as a non-smoker, but other materials show him lighting up. Tiny details that matter when multiplied by 3 decades of sequels, prequels, spin-offs, and localization quirks. The timeline looks less like a story and more like a conspiracy board in a detective's basement. Every new game means fans must redo the entire history they thought they knew. Remakes rewrite events, side stories introduce conflicting details, spin-offs hover in canonical limbo, only acknowledged if Capcom feels like it. So the fanbase responds by piecing together elaborate timelines, making deep dive videos, and debating obsessively like lore detectives desperate for answers. That's the real struggle here. Franchise running for 30 years, trying to reinvent itself again and again while pretending it's one continuous universe. Fans crave continuity, meaning and respect for their time spent unraveling virus origins and character arcs. They want confirmation that their hard work hasn't been erased every time a new creative team reimagines something. But Capcom keeps pushing forward, remaking, retconning, and the fans keep chasing, reconstructing, debating. It's an identity crisis disguised as a continuity crisis fueled by a community that cares more about this timeline than the people writing it apparently do, which is, not ideal. The files hid more. Rebecca basketball photo. In the original Resident Evil 2, if you wanted to see a secret photo of Rebecca Chambers, you had to stand at Albert Wesker's desk in the STARS office and search it 50 consecutive times. Not 49, huh? 50. No counter, no progress bar, just you, a desk, and the kind of obsessive repetition that defines both speedrunners and people who need to go outside. Do it right, and you'd receive Film D, which revealed a photo of Rebecca in a sporty outfit holding a basketball. It was the most Albert Wesker thing imaginable, a man so fixated on his subordinates that he kept glamour shots in his desk like trophies. The 2019 remake transforms the brute force desk, mashing into an actual treasure hunt. Players retrieve film from the sewers, develop it to reveal hidden locations, then open Wesker's drawer for weapon parts. But interact with the drawer second time, and a new role appears labeled Rising Rookie. Develop it, and you get a modernized Rebecca photo that reframes her as a capable professional rather than pin-up material. The Easter egg went from absurd button mashing to a multi-layered callback that respects both the original's weirdness and modern sensibilities. But if you think one ghost photo is disturbing, wait until you hear about the typo that became a piece of environmental storytelling: the welcome sign. Capcom's solution to a spelling error was not to delete it, but to build physical evidence of the mistake into the world. In the original 1998 Resident Evil 2, a handmade banner in the RPD West office greets Rookie Officer Leon S. Kennedy with "Welcome Leon," an extra L that was initially dismissed as another product of the series' famously rough early localization. The 2019 remake transforms the typo into an intentional meta-joke. The banner now reads, "Welcome," but one of the letters has visibly fallen off and can be found sitting on a nearby desk, retroactively providing a diegetic in-world explanation for why the original sign was misspelled. Here's the thing. This is a background banner with one extra letter that somehow became a statement about how remakes are shaped by fan scrutiny. Coverage of the remake reports that Capcom took note of fan discussions, including a Reddit post specifically highlighting the original typo, and deliberately honored that shared community memory in the environmental storytelling. The sign has become a beloved in-joke humanizing the RPD. The officers cared enough to throw a party for a rookie's first day. The decoration fell apart anyway, and Capcom cared enough to embed that failure into the next version of the game. But if you think one ghost of a misspelled banner is charming, wait until you see what happens when Capcom decides to honor the most infamous action set piece from their own film adaptation, the Laser Corridor. In the original 2005 Resident Evil 4, Leon encounters a laser corridor late in the game near Sadler's throne room, requiring the player to dodge timed laser patterns in a QTE sequence that many fans interpreted as a deliberate nod to the iconic dismemberment corridor from the 2002 live-action film. You know, the one where a grid of lasers gruesomely slices a soldier into cubes. The 2023 Resident Evil 4 remake's Separate Ways DLC repositions the corridor inside a communications facility, doubling as a laboratory, where content creators describe it as a laser-focused Easter egg. Capcom is now explicitly referencing its own reference to its own film adaptation, a recursive layer of self-parody spanning 18 years of design evolution. Here's the thing. Capcom has not released official statements confirming the original corridor was a direct film homage rather than an independent design choice. But the remake's deliberate repositioning and the tongue-in-cheek framing and coverage strongly support the Easter egg reading. And honestly, at this point, it doesn't matter. The Laser Corridor has become less a set piece than an internal franchise meme. The games seemed to mock the films, then absorb their imagery, then started being nostalgic about absorbing it. Community reaction splits between players who cite the Laser Corridor as emblematic of Resident Evil 4's over-the-top action drift and those who celebrate it in highlight reels as one of Leon's most iconic badass moments. Its preservation in the DLC was read as Capcom acknowledging that the corridor has become franchise canon, even though that canon originated in a film tie-in, which is, not ideal for purists. But if you think one recursive laser hallway is confusing, wait until you hear about the sentient block of tofu that's been canon since 1998. Tofu. Tofu started as a debugging tool and somehow became a 3-game legacy character with voice acting, a fan following, and the power to gatekeep other Easter eggs. Back when the Resident Evil 2 development team was fine-tuning collision detection, they needed a symbol of tofu, just a white cube. It worked. They kept using it. And then someone at Capcom had the brilliant idea to turn that throwaway programmer asset into a fully unlockable joke mode called the Tofu Survivor. You play the same brutal gauntlet as Hunk, except you're controlling a sentient block of tofu, armed only with a combat knife. No guns, no grenades, just a squishy white cube trying not to get eaten. The 2019 remake expands this into an entire cast of tofu variants, each with distinct loadouts and unique voice lines that play when zombies bite them. The mode demands careful knife conservation, zombie AI manipulation, and intentional hit trading to leverage iframes. It's not just a joke, it's a genuinely difficult mechanical challenge wrapped in the dumbest possible skin. And then, Resident Evil 9, Requiem embeds Tofu as a blink and you'll miss it cameo inside the RPD, where the character's presence is tied to a locker key that unlocks yet another Easter egg. Tofu is now functioning as a gatekeeper to other secrets across 3 generations. In the community, unlocking Tofu in the original game was treated as elite-level proof of dedication. With the remake's streaming boom, the Tofu Survivor became a staple of challenge runs and no-damage attempts. Tofu is now routinely cited alongside Mr. Raccoon figurines as evidence of Capcom's signature tonal balance of serious horror with deeply unserious secrets. A squishy white cube groaning in pain while zombies chew on it shouldn't work, but it does. But if you think a sentient tofu block is the strangest thing Capcom has hidden in this series, wait until you hear about the wine bottle that connects a vampire castle to the founder of Umbrella Corporation, Sanguis Virginis wine bottle. Sanguis Virginis is either the most sophisticated puzzle key in Resident Evil Village, or proof that Lady Dimitrescu's marketing team understood branding centuries before Instagram existed. And honestly, it's both. The name translates to Blood of the Virgin, which is exactly the kind of gothic melodrama you'd expect from a family of vampires running a vineyard since the 15th century. You find it in Castle Dimitrescu's kitchen after defeating Bella. Carry it to the wine room, place it in a special holder, and it opens a secret passage. Because of course the aristocratic, blood-drinking family hides their doors behind ornate wine bottles. But here's where it gets interesting. In the Mercenaries mode, Sanguis Virginis only appears as a recovery item for Alcina Dimitrescu. Not for Ethan, not for Chris, not as generic loot, just her. The blood wine is tied exclusively to her character identity, which means Capcom decided this wasn't just a puzzle prop, it was her thing. Then Resident Evil 9. Requiem places a wine bottle labeled Dimitrescu in a helipad-adjacent room filled with cross-game reference props sitting right next to a photograph of Mother Miranda. That's when the Easter egg does its third job. It confirms that within the Resident Evil universe, Lady Dimitrescu's blood wine brand has become famous enough to earn recognition in other settings. The luxury product made from murder victims is now, apparently, a collectible. The community has embraced this with the exact energy you'd expect. Fans have produced mock wine reviews, imagined marketing slogans for a product literally made from sacrificial maidens, and created fan art of the bottle like real vintage. When Easter egg hunters found the Dimitrescu bottle in Requiem, they read it as confirmation that Capcom understands Alcina. Dimitrescu dominated the cultural conversation around Village, so Sanguis Virginis does triple duty. Puzzle solution, vampiric world building, character identity marker, and cross-game celebrity cameo. It's a centuries-old aristocratic blood wine, and also it's basically a meme now. But if you think a fancy wine bottle is the strangest thing Capcom has hidden in these games, wait until you see what they did with a piece of 1980s box art that nobody wanted to remember. Mega Man box art Resident Evil 3 remakes Downtown Raccoon City is basically a museum of Capcom's entire back catalog, and the developers knew exactly what they were doing. Walk through the streets and you'll see posters for Dr. Wily, Dr. Light, Big Wave Shop from Mega Man Star Force, billboards advertising 1942 and Ghosts and Goblins. It's a love letter to the company's history plastered across a city that is about to be destroyed. But here's where it gets weird. The Toy Uncle Super Shop has a display counter with Mega Man action figures, and one of them is designed to look like bad box art Mega Man. Not the cool, heroic Mega Man everyone knows, the embarrassing one. The one with awkward proportions, a miscolored suit, and a realistic handgun instead of an arm cannon. The version that became a decades-long joke about how badly the original Western Mega Man 1 cover misrepresented the game. Capcom didn't use the iconic design, they used the worst one. That choice tells you everything about the intent. This is a company comfortable enough with its own history to put its most notorious marketing failure in a toy store and light it on fire with zombies. The meta layer is what makes this land. Within the Resident Evil universe, children in Raccoon City apparently played with figures based on embarrassing marketing history. A joke that only works if you know both franchises' paratextual lore. If you recognize that the toy on the shelf isn't just Mega Man, It's the meme version immortalized in plastic and placed in a doomed city as a monument to Capcom's willingness to laugh at itself. Players paused Nemesis encounters to zoom in on toy shelves. Theorists debate whether Raccoon City canonically exists in a world where Mega Man is fictional or in some stranger shared Capcom universe. The game deliberately leaves it open, which is the point. The warmth of these hidden Capcom artifacts tucked into a horror setting is genuinely moving in a weird way. Raccoon City is about to be destroyed, and its toy stores are quietly celebrating a company's entire legacy, one bad box art figure at a time. But if you think a toy store full of nostalgic Capcom references is the strangest thing hidden in these remakes, wait until you see what the developers buried in Resident Evil 7. The ghost of Resident Evil 7 Capcom turned a free demo into a haunted ARG object. The Resident Evil 7 Biohazard beginning hour demo isn't really a sample of the full game. It's a puzzle box that happens to also be a horror demo, and at the center of it is a ghost nobody can explain. Throughout the demo, a spectral woman can be spotted in up to 7 specific locations. She appears during the Sewer Gators VHS segment, peeking from doorways, standing in the yard, vanishing around corners. Blink and you miss her. Capcom has never confirmed who she is. Fan theories range from Eveline to Mia to a scrapped character concept. The mystery is the point, but the ghost isn't just a visual Easter egg. She's the engine behind one of the strangest meta puzzles in the series. Hidden in the demo is the dummy finger puzzle, and solving it requires the internet to collectively lose its mind. Players must collect a dummy finger, pair it with a dummy hand to form a pointing gesture, then trigger 5 distinct ghostly giggles by pointing at specific environmental targets in sequence. A blood stain, a painting of a woman with a bag over her head, a voodoo doll covered door, a mirror, wiring above a bed in the attic. Let me repeat that. The solution to this puzzle is to point a severed mannequin hand at specific things until a ghost laughs at you 5 times. Community members spent weeks collaboratively decoding this from scratch. Forums drove iterative experimentation until each giggle trigger was mapped. Nobody knew what the finger was for until the internet decided that the answer had to be point a severed mannequin hand at specific things. And they were right. Successfully triggering all 5 giggles rewards the dirty coin, an inventory item that carries over into the full release of Resident Evil 7, and provides a small gameplay advantage. The ghost-centric meta-puzzle becomes a bridge between demo and retail game, turning a free teaser into a functional treasure hunt. The ghost's deliberately unexplained identity has continued to generate content years after release. She's never been given a name, never been tied to a specific character, never been acknowledged by the developers. She just exists, flickering in and out of the Baker house, giggling when you point at the right objects, and then vanishing into the lore as one of the series' most unsettling unanswered questions. At least it's just one ghost. If you think that's disturbing, wait until you hear about the time Capcom hid an entire fighting game franchise inside Raccoon City's streets, Street Fighter Punch. Resident Evil and Street Fighter don't just share a publisher, they share a secret language. And if you're not fluent in both franchises, you'll walk right past some of the most layered Easter eggs Capcom has ever built in Resident Evil 7. Biohazard, at least one in-game object, functions as a beautifully subtle reference to Street Fighter, though the exact asset varies depending on who you ask. But the real crossover happens at the controller level. Certain Street Fighter games hide Resident Evil-themed costumes behind an Easter egg code that requires you to hold light punch, medium punch, heavy punch, light kick, and up during loading screens. That's not a menu option. That's a command input. Your muscle memory from Hadoukens and Shoryukens is literally the key to unlocking Jill's outfit on Cammy. Capcom turned a fighting game control scheme into a scavenger hunt password, and only players who've spent hours in training mode would even think to try it. But here's where it gets weird. The original 1998 Resident Evil 2 includes a shop near the police station labeled Aruka's. If you're not paying attention, it's just another piece of downtown Raccoon City set dressing. But Easter egg hunters figured it out immediately. Aruka's is Sakura spelled backwards, a direct reference to Street Fighter Alpha 2's Schoolgirl Fighter. You need to have played both franchises, recognized a reversed 5-letter word on a storefront texture, and connected it to a completely different game series to even register that it exists. Capcom embedded a Street Fighter character name into the architecture of Raccoon City, and it's been sitting there for 27 years. The relationship operates as a two-way ecosystem. Street Fighter games embed Resident Evil costume content unlockable through fighting game inputs, while Resident Evil games hide Street Fighter character names in reversed environmental signage. It's a loop of mutual acknowledgement that treats both franchises as sharing an internal history of deliberate decodable nods. Not crossover events, not DLC collaborations, just quiet, persistent reminders that if you know, you know. Community reaction is less about lore theorizing and more about brand loyal delight. Fans share screenshots of reversed character names with captions joking about Raccoon City stocking merchandise from Capcom's fighting circuit. Many players now enter new Resident Evil releases actively expecting at least one Street Fighter homage as a franchise rite of passage. It's not a surprise anymore, it's a checklist item. And if you think archaeology of 1998 shop names is niche, wait until you hear about the family tree hidden in a single lockpick. Like mother, like daughter. Grace Ashcroft is either the most important new protagonist in Resident Evil 9 or the deepest cut Capcom has ever made, and I can prove it. The first time you use a lockpick in Requiem, typically on some random drawer in the lead researcher's office, an achievement pops, like mother, like daughter. Most players will shrug and move on. But if you know your Resident Evil history, that phrase just connected a mainline numbered entry to a pair of PlayStation 2 online spin-offs that most of the fanbase has never touched. Grace Ashcroft is the daughter of Alyssa Ashcroft, a playable investigative reporter from Resident Evil Outbreak and Resident Evil Outbreak File 2. Alyssa's entire mechanical identity in those games was her ability to use lockpicks to open doors and containers that other survivors couldn't access. She was the boundary pusher, the one who got into places she wasn't supposed to be. Requiem passes that trait directly to Grace, and the achievement triggers the exact moment Grace literally does what her mother did 2 decades ago in a different game on different hardware that Capcom shut the servers down for in 2007. Here's the thing. The achievement is deliberately easy to obtain. You don't need to lockpick 50 drawers or find some hidden Outbreak reference file first. You just need one drawer, one lockpick, one action. The designers wanted nearly every player to see that phrase appear on screen, making the Outbreak callback accessible instead of burying it behind extreme challenges. It's a statement of intent. Capcom is telling you that Outbreak happened, that Alyssa mattered, and that her legacy is now woven into the main timeline through her daughter. Requiem doesn't stop there. Grace's outfits reference Alyssa's wardrobe. Files scattered through the game allude to her reporting work. The entire narrative structure, Grace as an analyst piecing together Umbrella's crimes, from fragments and locked files, mirrors Alyssa's investigative instincts. Capcom is finally honoring legacy characters beyond Chris, Jill, and Leon, pulling from the margins of its own history, and saying those stories count too. Community reception was warm and for Outbreak fans, genuinely emotional. Outbreak has one of the smallest but most loyal fan bases in the series, a group that has spent nearly 20 years campaigning for the spin-off's characters to receive mainline recognition. When Grace was revealed as Alyssa's daughter, forums lit up. When the achievement triggered, players who had spent the early 2000s grinding through Outbreak scenarios with Alyssa felt seen. The loop closed. The people who loved the strangest, most forgotten corners of Resident Evil were right all along. Like mother, like daughter unlocks in seconds. What it represents took more than 20 years to arrive. It's a franchise acknowledging that the secrets matter, that the spin-offs matter, that the players who refused to let Outbreak fade into obscurity were doing the work of preservation all along. Grace inherits Alyssa's lockpick. The fandom inherits the Outbreak community's refusal to forget. And Resident Evil, for all its horror and corporate conspiracy, remains a series that remembers. Rewrites change the truth. The lore is essentially a stack of revelations balanced on top of more revelations, and Capcom has gotten very, very good at making sure none of it is what it looks like. Here are the 10 most franchise-shaking twists in Resident Evil history, ranked by how hard each one detonated the universe around it. Starting with personal betrayals and ending with the reveal that quietly rewrote 30 years of canon. Ada Wong is a corporate spy. You spend most of Resident Evil 2 thinking Ada Wong is a journalist tracking down her missing boyfriend John, a researcher who supposedly disappeared during the Raccoon City outbreak. She is mysterious, she is competent, she handles a pistol better than any non-cop civilian has any right to, and there is a small, growing romantic thing between her and Leon S. Kennedy that the game keeps quietly leaning into. The whole framing is regular woman in over her head. Then a phone call goes off, and the entire performance falls apart. Ada is not a journalist. There is no missing boyfriend. The grieving girlfriend routine was a cover story, and the woman Leon has been bleeding for is a corporate spy sent into Raccoon City to extract a sample of the G-virus from William Birkin's body for arrival of Umbrella. Every soft moment between them was a tactical resource Ada was managing while she got closer to the prize. The lore ripple here is significant, because Ada becomes the first major character in the franchise to operate outside the Umbrella versus Survivors binary. Up until that phone call, everyone in Resident Evil is either an Umbrella employee, an Umbrella victim, or someone trying to stop Umbrella. Ada introduces a third category: rival corporations, professional industrial espionage, a whole shadow market where the viruses are products and survivors are collateral. She becomes the bridge to that world for the rest of the franchise. The psychological shock lands hardest in the moment. Ada takes the bullet meant for Leon and seemingly dies in his arms, because by that point you have already learned she has been lying to him the entire game, and you cannot tell whether the sacrifice is real loyalty finally surfacing or one last extraction trick. Leon does not get to know either. He spends the next 20 years still in love with a woman whose actual name and employer he has never been told. Mia Winters is an operative for the Connections. Resident Evil 7 sells you a domestic horror story. Your wife Mia disappears 3 years ago. You get a video message telling you she is alive at a creepy plantation in Louisiana, and you drive out there as a regular guy trying to rescue a regular woman from whatever swamp cult has taken her. The first hour of the game is paced like a found footage movie about a husband walking into a haunted house with absolutely no business being there. You are an everyman. Mia is the victim. The Bakers are the monsters. Then you find Mia's recorded confession and the whole framing inverts. Mia was never a babysitter, and the trip on the tanker was never a normal job. She was an operative for the Connections, a bioorganic weapons trafficking organization, and her actual assignment was the secure transport of Eveline, the engineered bioorganic weapon at the center of the entire game. The reason your wife disappeared for 3 years is that her ship crashed while she was hauling a living biological weapon as cargo. And the reason the Bakers are monsters is because Mia's containment failed and Eveline got out. The lore ripple introduces the Connections as a successor to Umbrella's bioorganic weapons trafficking shadow, a privatized post-Umbrella ecosystem where the science kept moving even after the corporation collapsed. It also recasts Ethan from innocent husband to man, married to a woman whose actual job is biological weapons logistics, a dynamic the rest of the saga never fully resolves. The shockwave for Ethan is layered with horror because by the time he learns who Mia really is, he has already been infected, mutated, and partially possessed by the same bioorganic weapon Mia was supposed to be guarding. The revelation does not give him answers. It just tells him that the woman he was trying to save was the reason he needed saving in the first place. Jill Valentine is the masked figure. Resident Evil 5 spends most of its runtime introducing a mysterious masked operative working alongside Albert Wesker. She moves with combat training nobody else in the field has. She fights you in coordinated set pieces with Wesker calling the shots, and she is rendered with just enough detail to make you sure you are supposed to recognize her under the mask. You spend the entire game waiting for the reveal, half suspecting the answer the whole time. Then Chris Redfield rips the mask off and it is Jill Valentine. His partner, his best friend, the woman everyone had assumed died at the end of the prior arc, tied to Spencer's estate. Jill survived her fall. Wesker collected her body. He kept her preserved, then implanted her with control device and reconditioned her into a personal bodyguard, weaponizing the closest person in Chris's life against him. The lore ripple here recontextualizes the entire space between Resident Evil 1 and 5. Jill has been alive this whole time in Wesker's custody, being used as a research subject and a weapon. It also confirms how much further Wesker has drifted from anything human. He's not just running bioterrorism operations. He is mind-controlling Chris's best friend for sport. The control mechanism would later become a recurring piece of franchise tech, showing up in different forms across spin-off material and side games The psychological shockwave is one of the few moments in the entire franchise where Chris audibly breaks. He spends the rest of the fight half fighting Jill, half pleading with her to come back, and the gameplay loop punishes you for hurting her. You are supposed to disable the control device on her chest, not kill her. It is the closest the series ever gets to making the player feel actively bad about pulling the trigger, and the resolution, when it finally comes, is more relief than victory. Spencer Mansion is just a front for an underground laboratory. For most of the first Resident Evil, the Spencer Mansion appears to be exactly what it advertises, a creepy gothic estate owned by a wealthy eccentric, somehow overrun by zombies and monsters because a virus got loose somewhere on the property. You spend hours solving puzzles built around suits of armor, antique paintings, a piano nobody is playing, and a dining room with a clock you absolutely have to interact with. The Atmos? Fear as old money goes wrong. Then you find the elevator, then another elevator, then a series of stairwells, then a hidden door behind a bookshelf, behind which is an industrial corridor that descends into a fully operational, underground, biological research laboratory. The mansion is not a haunted estate at all. It is a deliberately designed disguise, a Victorian skin draped over a massive, corporate bioorganic weapons facility owned and operated by the Umbrella Corporation, where the zombies, hunters, and that one giant snake you fought in the attic were all engineered on site. The lore ripple from this single discovery is enormous in retrospect, because it establishes the foundational pattern that defines the rest of the franchise. Every Resident Evil location that follows, the Raccoon City sewers, the Antarctic base, the African oil refinery, the Spanish village, the Louisiana plantation, the Romanian castle, is the Spencer Mansion structure repeated. There is always a normal facade. There is always something monstrous engineered beneath it. The mansion is the prototype, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it anywhere else in the series. The shockwave at the time was less betrayal and more scale shift. You came in expecting a haunted house, and you exit with the dawning understanding that the haunted house was the lobby. Everything you thought was the entire game was actually the opening level, and the real horror was something a corporation built on purpose on paper, with a budget line item. Albert Wesker is an Umbrella double agent. Captain Albert Wesker is supposed to be your boss. He is the leader of STAR's Alpha Team, your tactical commander, the man who sent you into the Arklay Mountains to investigate the disappearance of Bravo Team. He spends most of Resident Evil 1 conveniently absent during dangerous encounters, and conveniently present whenever someone needs a calm voice telling the survivors what to do next. In hindsight, his uniform never gets dirty. The reveal lands in the laboratory beneath the mansion. Wesker is not a cop, he never was. He is a senior Umbrella researcher who engineered the entire mansion incident as a controlled live fire test using STARS as expendable combat data, armed humans deployed against bioorganic weapons in a sealed environment with every encounter logged for product development. The people he sent to die were running quality assurance on Umbrella's products. He took the badge and the rank precisely so he could choose who walked into the meat grinder. The lower ripple from this twist is the entire shape of the franchise. Wesker becomes the through-line antagonist who survives across multiple games, betrays Umbrella itself, joins shadow organizations, builds his own bioorganic weapon empire, and eventually attempts global infection in Resident Evil 5. None of that exists if his Resident Evil 1 reveal does not land. He is the first character to prove that the real threat in Resident Evil was never the monsters. It was the people who made them, dressed as the people who fight them. The psychological shockwave hits in the cutscene, where he is impaled by the tyrant he just unleashed on the survivors, dies dramatically, and is then revealed in later games to have injected himself with an experimental virus that resurrected him with superhuman speed, strength, and reflexes. The franchise basically used his fake death to upgrade him from villainous handler to near immortal apex antagonist. Every Wesker scene from that point forward carries the weight of a man who got promoted by his own betrayal. Oswell E. Spencer is murdered by Wesker. For almost 10 real-world years and 3 full game generations, Oswell E. Spencer exists as a name in files. He is the founder of Umbrella. He is the mansion's owner. He is the unseen architect behind every virus, every facility, every monster the series has thrown at you. The series treats him as a kind of remote god, old, sick, hidden in a private European estate, untouchable. Players have spent the entire franchise waiting to meet him, Resident Evil 5 finally puts him on screen for about 90 seconds before Wesker kills him. Wesker arrives at Spencer's manor demanding answers about Project W, the experimental program Spencer ran on a group of gifted children, of which Wesker himself was one. And Spencer, frail in his wheelchair, calmly explains that he had always intended to use his viruses to create a new species of godlike humans. Wesker, who is one of those engineered humans, decides that he is the god in question, and that Spencer is therefore obsolete. He impales him through the chest and walks out of the room. The lore ripple is structural. The death of Spencer ends the original Umbrella era completely. Every villain who came before Wesker now traces back to a man who can no longer answer for any of it. It also reframes Wesker's whole arc. He is not just a rogue researcher anymore. He is the surviving end product of Spencer's own ambitions, the experiment that outlived the experimenter. Project W becomes one of the most important pieces of franchise backstory, all unlocked by a single conversation. The shockwave of the moment is the quiet of it. Spencer barely resists. Wesker barely raises his voice. The man behind decades of horror dies in a 5-minute conversation in a dim study on a rainy night with no music swell and no boss fight. The most powerful figure in Resident Evil history exits like a deleted line of code. Eveline is the withered old woman. Resident Evil 7 keeps showing you a strange, blue-eyed little girl. Sometimes she appears in cutscenes. Sometimes she leaves drawings on the walls. Sometimes she just stands in the corner of a room and watches you. The Baker family talks about her as if she were a real child, and the framing of the game actively encourages you to read her as something like a ghost, a vengeful little girl spirit haunting the estate, possibly responsible for the Baker's madness. The reveal is that she is neither a ghost nor a little girl. Eveline is a bioweapon designated Ashura-01, a fully grown engineered being whose growth has been catastrophically accelerated. The little girl you keep seeing is a hallucination. She projects into infected hosts as part of her psychological control mechanism, a stable form she chose for herself before her body started failing. Her actual physical form, the withered old woman you find strapped to a chair in the deepest part of the house, is what she really looks like at the end of her artificially compressed lifespan. The child was the costume. The dying old woman was the truth. The lore ripple reframes the entire family. The Bakers are not evil. They are infected, hallucinating Eveline as their adopted daughter, treating her as a child because the bioweapon has hijacked their perception. Jack, Marguerite, Lucas, all of them are victims of a single, weaponized little girl-shaped delusion. The reveal also introduces the mold and the bioorganic weapon E-Series, which becomes the entire engine of the next 2 mainline games and reshapes what a Resident Evil monster even is. The shockwave is the moment the camera pulls in on the figure in the chair and your brain reassembles every previous Eveline scene around the new information, every drawing on the wall, every shadow in the corner, every time she said, "Play with me." All of it was an old, dying, engineered organism using a child's mask to seduce a family into loving her before her body finally gave out. Ethan Winters has been dead since Resident Evil 7. For all of Resident Evil 7 and most of Resident Evil Village, Ethan Winters is your regular guy protagonist. He gets hurt, he bleeds, he staples his own hand back on, he pours mysterious healing fluids on missing fingers and watches them reattach. The franchise frames all of this as Ethan is tough, or the healing items are very good, or this is just video game logic. Do not think about it too much. Resident Evil Village's final act asks you to think about it. Chris Redfield's intelligence files, combined with a quiet revelation from the Duke, confirm that Ethan was killed by Jack Baker at the start of Resident Evil 7. When he had his hand severed and his throat opened during the dinner table scene, the mold revived him, took over his cellular structure, and rebuilt him as a mold-based duplicate that retained his memories and personality. Every healing animation across 2 full games was mold reconstructing tissue. Every survival moment was a corpse refusing to stop. The lower ripple retroactively rewrites both Resident Evil 7 and Village. Ethan is not a survivor protagonist in the traditional sense. He is the first playable character in the franchise who is fundamentally a bioorganic weapon himself, made of the same substance as the monsters he is fighting. It also refrains the BSAA's interest in him. In 7, he was a useful probe, a mold-compatible host walking unwittingly toward the source organism, and nobody told him because nobody needed him to know. The psychological shockwave belongs to Ethan, who has roughly 5 minutes between learning the truth about his own body and using that truth to defeat Mother Miranda. He gets to be a hero and a corpse at the same time. He says goodbye to his daughter. He dies on screen, finally, properly, after 2 games of postponed death. It is one of the only times the franchise has let an ending feel earned, because the protagonist had to die to make it. The Umbrella Corporation went bankrupt off-screen. The Umbrella Corporation is the spine of Resident Evil. It is the antagonist of the first 3 mainline games, the maker of every important virus, the employer of every important villain, and the engine of the entire franchise's plot. After Raccoon City is destroyed at the end of Resident Evil 3, you understandably expect the next big game to be about taking Umbrella down for good, exposing the conspiracy, dragging the executives in front of a tribunal, the whole catharsis. Resident Evil 4 opens with a text crawl that casually mentions Umbrella has already collapsed off-screen between games. The corporation that defined the entire series went bankrupt in the legal and economic fallout of the Raccoon City disaster, collapsed under the legal and economic fallout, and is essentially gone before the new game even begins. Leon, now a federal agent, is sent to rescue the president's daughter from a Spanish cult, and the entire Umbrella plot you spent 3 games building toward is handled in a sentence at the top of the credits. The lore ripple from this decision was the franchise's biggest pivot. Bioweapons stopped being one company's product and became a globalized black market. Tricell, the Connections, Neo Umbrella, the BSAA, and an entire ecosystem of post-Umbrella organizations rushed into the vacuum. The series broadened from fight one evil corporation to fight whatever organization caught the loose viruses this week. Without Umbrella's off-screen death, none of the modern Resident Evil shape exists. No Plagas, no mold, no Las Plagas-derived villages, no connections. The shockwave at the time was real fan whiplash. The series had spent years promising a confrontation, and Capcom decided the confrontation was less interesting than the aftermath. The reaction split players for years, but in retrospect, the move freed the franchise from a single recurring villain and forced it to grow up into a sprawling, decentralized, scarier world where the bad guys do not all share a logo. Mother Miranda orchestrated the entire history of Umbrella. Resident Evil Village introduces Mother Miranda as the regional antagonist, a powerful, mold-empowered woman ruling a small Romanian village, manipulating the Four Lords, kidnapping Ethan's daughter for a ritual to resurrect her own long-dead child. She's framed as one more local horror in a franchise full of them. Big villain, contained setting, personal stakes. Then her files reveal that she was Oswell E. Spencer's mentor a century ago. Young Oswell sat at Miranda's feet and listened to her preach about her godlike megamycete fungus, about the resurrection of the dead, about using biology to escape mortality. Her ideas, sanitized them, industrialized them, and built the Umbrella Corporation on top of them. Every virus Umbrella ever produced, progenitor, TG, all of it, traces back to research originally derived from Miranda's mold and her quiet century of experimentation in the Carpathian Mountains. The lore ripple is total. Umbrella did not invent Resident Evil's biology, Miranda did, and Spencer copied her homework. Every monster you have ever fought, every survivor you have ever played, every cutscene Wesker ever monologued in, all of it is downstream of a grieving mother in a Romanian village, trying to bring her dead daughter back. The franchise's entire backstory was always her story. Everyone else was a footnote in it. Spencer, Wesker, Birkin, the entire bioorganic weapons industrial complex, they are her students, twice removed. The shockwave of this twist is structural rather than emotional. It does not break any one character's world the way Ada's reveal broke Leon's, or the way Eveline's reveal broke the Bakers. It breaks the franchise's world. The villain of one game turns out to be the silent architect of every other game's existence, and you only learn this in optional documents you have to actively read. Capcom buried the biggest twist in the entire series in a side file, which is somehow the most Resident Evil decision they could have possibly made. Whole places disappeared. Before Raccoon City burned, before any of this went global, there was a single estate in the Arklay Mountains that should not have existed, and I can prove it The Spencer Mansion outbreak kicks off in summer 1998 when STARS teams are sent in after weeks of bizarre cannibal attacks nearby. But the mansion's real horror starts decades earlier. In the late 1960s, Oswell Spencer hires architect George Trevor to design a luxury estate that isn't actually a luxury estate. It's a death trap. Moving walls, hidden elevators, puzzle locks on every door. Trevor's own family is used to test the traps and dies in the process, years before any virus exists. Beneath the ballroom sits a full umbrella laboratory where the T-virus is developed. When containment fails, researchers turn into zombies, experimental animals escape into the surrounding forest, and the infection spreads outward until it puts STARS on the doorstep. By the time Alpha Team arrives, the estate is a vertical tomb. Luxury on top, cages and test chambers below. Albert Wesker initiates the self-destruct as part of his plan to fake his death and steal Umbrella's data. The explosion collapses the underground labs and erases the mansion entirely. The most disturbing part is that Spencer built this place to be a nightmare on purpose. The architect finished the labyrinth, and then Spencer had him killed too. The virus just gave it teeth, but at least the Spencer mansion stayed in the mountain. The next location took an entire civic building down with it, Raccoon City Police Department. The RPD is a repurposed early 20th century art museum, which sounds fancy until you realize that means officers responding to a zombie outbreak have to solve art puzzles to reach their own storage rooms. The station was converted into police headquarters in the mid-1990s, a few years before the outbreak. This explains the grandiose main hall, the towering goddess statue, and the fact that critical doors are secured by 3 medallions, spade-shaped keys, and gemstone-fitted reliefs instead of normal key cards. Nothing says effective law enforcement like aligning mythological symbols just to reach the evidence locker. But here's where it gets darker. Chief Brian Irons, corrupt and on Umbrella's payroll, deliberately maintained the building's eccentric layout to reinforce his own control and indulge his, sadistic hobbies. The RPD isn't a poorly designed civic building. It's an institutional death trap engineered by a man who wanted it that way. When the outbreak hits, the station becomes a convergence point for infected officers returning from patrol, civilians in holding cells, and contaminated ventilation systems. Lickers exploit the high ceilings and narrow corridors. Mr. X, the T-00 tyrant deployed by Umbrella, patrols methodically through the halls, forcing survivors into constant desperate motion. Limited exits are sealed or blocked, and once zombies breach key internal corridors, everyone inside is simply trapped. By the time Leon Kennedy and Claire Redfield arrive, most of the survivors died during the events of the game. The RPD is Raccoon City in microcosm, a place meant to protect people where image and performance took precedence over function. And when disaster struck, the city paid for it in blood. But one building was just the beginning. Wait until you hear about the entire city that got turned into a crater, Raccoon City. Raccoon City is a company town, and the company is Umbrella. Every factory, hospital, and underground lab ties directly back to corporate payroll, which means, when things go bad, accountability gets sacrificed faster than a test subject. The pre-outbreak population sits around 100,000 residents. By October 1st, 1998, survivors number in the dozens. Here's what nobody talks about. The city doesn't fall in a single explosion. It collapses over roughly 1 week in late September 1998, 2 months after Spencer Mansion. The T-virus spreads through multiple vectors, contaminated rats crawling through sewers, flushing infected waste into water mains, turning grocery stores and bus stops into zombie choke points. Then William Birkin injects himself with the G-virus after Umbrella's own security forces gun him down in the sewers, adding a secondary layer of viral contamination that makes an already catastrophic situation exponentially worse. Peak chaos hits September 28th to 30th. The streets are gridlocked with overturned cars and flaming barricades. Alleys that used to be shortcuts become dead ends packed with infected. Every familiar urban space, the kind you walk through every day without thinking, turns into a tactical nightmare. And the response? A government-authorized missile strike vaporizes the entire city on October 1st. Structures, roads, people, all of it reduced to a massive crater. The official story calls it containment. The reality is a grim political calculus. It's cheaper to erase 100,000 people than hold a corporation accountable. Survivors like Jill Valentine and Leon Kennedy become inconvenient living evidence. witnesses to an urban execution disguised as a biohazard protocol. This is the moment Resident Evil stops being gothic horror in an isolated mansion and becomes a techno-thriller about geopolitics, cover-ups, and how fast a city can be written off when the math says it's worth less than the scandal. But at least it was just one city, unlike the militarized prison island that got bombed into rubble for similar reasons, Rockfort Island. Rockfort Island might be the most confused piece of real estate in the entire franchise. On paper, it's a prison, but it's also a military training facility, an aristocratic palace, and a research lab, all on one remote island operated by Umbrella, which is, not ideal. The architecture makes zero sense unless you understand that the Ashford family built this place. The prison complex sits within sight of Baroque ballrooms filled with family portraits. Inmates stare through bars at chandeliers and oil paintings of inbred nobility. The palace features hidden switches inside antique music boxes, portrait galleries with secret passages, and a private dollhouse suite tied to Alfred Ashford's split persona obsession with his twin sister, Alexia. Torture cells exist directly beneath rooms decorated like a European estate in late 1998. A commando unit led by Albert Wesker raids the facility and releases bioorganic weapons across the island. The T-virus tears through the confined population with brutal efficiency because isolation, Rockford's greatest strength, becomes its fatal weakness. No evacuation routes, no backup, just cells, corridors, and ocean. But the real prize on Rockford isn't the T-virus. It's the T. Veronica virus developed by Alexia Ashford through decades of research. Alexia placed herself in 15-year cryogenic sleep to allow full viral assimilation, meaning Rockford has been quietly harboring one of the most dangerous bioorganic weapons in the world the entire time. By the time Claire Redfield arrives, the island is already doomed. Shortly after Wesker's assault, Rockford is bombarded with missiles. What's left of the prison, the palace, and the training facilities burns to rubble. The Ashfords' obsession with their family legacy ends where it began, isolated, burning, and erased from the map. But if you think one ghost island is disturbing, wait until you hear about the cruise ship where luxury and horror collide in the middle of the Mediterranean, Queen Zenobia. The Queen Zenobia is a luxury cruise ship operating in the Mediterranean, which sounds great until you realize it's secretly controlled by a bioterrorist organization called Il Veltro, and used as a floating laboratory for a water-based virus that could destroy entire coastal cities through the drinking supply. Not ideal. The upper decks look exactly like you'd expect from a Titanic-style liner, Art Deco dining rooms, velvet rope casinos, gilded theaters, all of it now deserted, lit only by flickering emergency lights, casting long shadows down empty corridors. Just the hum of failing generators and the distant groan of steel under stress. Below those public spaces, hidden in service corridors and engine rooms, are laboratories storing T-Abyss, a marine-adapted variant of the T-virus designed to spread through water. This is the nightmare scenario, a pathogen that doesn't need bites or airborne transmission, just contamination of a single water source. Drop it in a harbor or coastal treatment plant and entire cities drink themselves to death. The ocean itself becomes the weapon. Il Veltro deliberately flooded entire sections of the hull to create breeding grounds for ooze creatures, gelatinous mutants with elongated limbs that slide through flooded corridors, climb walls, and ambush from submerged doorways. The architecture isn't just claustrophobic because it's a ship. It's claustrophobic because there are no streets to escape into, no open fields, just steel walls, churning ocean, and rising water that turns every hallway into a potential drowning chamber. By the mission's end, the Queen Zenobia is listing heavily, taking on water from explosions and structural damage, sinking into the Mediterranean with its laboratories and most of the T-Abyss samples, a symbol of luxury and global tourism turned into a silent doomsday vessel that could have poisoned half of Europe's coastline. But at least it's just one ship sinking quietly into the ocean, unlike the next location, which is a family home in Louisiana that becomes ground zero for a fungal nightmare that rewrites the rules of infection entirely. Baker House, the Spencer Mansion, was aristocratic horror, marble statues, grand halls, puzzles carved into expensive furniture. The Baker House is something else entirely. It's a rotting Louisiana plantation near Dulvey, and it doesn't pretend to be anything but what it is, a real family home, violently corrupted from the inside out. Events occur in 2017, long after Raccoon City, but the scale is smaller, more intimate, and somehow worse because of it. Here's what happened. In 2014, the Bakers rescue what appears to be an orphaned child named Eveline from a shipwreck in the nearby swamp. Compassionate people doing a compassionate thing. Within days, the mold infiltrates their bodies and minds. Eveline is an E-series molded bioweapon, a fungal organism designed to spread through physical infection and psychic domination. By the time they realize something is wrong, they're already gone. The mold spreads throughout the house like a living organism, infiltrating walls, floors, air ducts. Black tar-like fungal growths ooze from every surface, giving rise to humanoid creatures called molded. The estate consists of the main house, guest house, boathouse, and outbuildings surrounded by swamp. Every single space becomes a trap. Narrow staircases, hidden passages behind walls, crawl spaces that force you into close contact with things that should not exist. Lucas Baker, one of the sons, constructs elaborate traps under Eveline's influence, bomb collars, saw-like death game contraptions, shadow projector puzzles that require aligning objects to form specific silhouettes just to unlock a door. The family home becomes a theater of cruelty, each room a stage for torture. But here's the thing. This isn't some corporate lab gone wrong. This is a dinner table where a family used to eat, a bedroom where a child used to sleep. The horror is domestic, and that intimacy makes it unbearable. After Eveline is defeated using a specialized serum, her rapidly aging body crystallizes and disintegrates. The mold network collapses. The infection dies with her, but the house remains, a monument to what happens when compassion meets something that was never meant to exist. But if you think one ghost is disturbing, wait until you hear about the feudal fortress ruled by a 9F tall vampiric noblewoman conducting Ka-DOH parasitic experiments in the shadow of an ancient fungal root system, Castle Dimitrescu. Almost every Resident Evil location is horrifying because something went wrong, but Castle Dimitrescu is horrifying because everything went exactly according to plan. This is not a containment failure. This is a feudal fortress purpose, built to feed on human beings, where torture, blood harvesting, and parasitic experimentation are the point. Lady Alcina Dimitrescu, a 9F tall vampiric noblewoman mutated by a Ka-DOH parasite, derived from the mold, presides over the entire operation like a feudal lord. Her 3 daughters are not her actual children. They are mutant constructs formed from flies coalescing around parasite-infused host material, which is, not ideal. Grand halls, filled with gilded portraits and crimson drapery, sit directly above torture chambers disguised as cellars, and a network of catacombs lets Dimitrescu and her daughters move unseen through the walls, turning the corridors into a predatory circulatory system. Below all of it sits the Megamycete, a colossal fungal root organism linking every location in the region through a mold network. The Ka-DOH parasite itself is derived from Megamycete fragments implanted into villagers during rituals and experiments. In Dimitrescu's case, the parasite interacts with a pre-existing blood disease to produce her towering stature, vampiric regeneration, and the castle full of lesser mutants representing failed implantations. Vampire folklore gets reinterpreted through bioorganic weapon science, and the result is a castle where every bottle of wine is a war crime. When Ethan Winters kills Dimitrescu in her dragon-like transformed state, sections of the castle crumble and burn. The later destruction of the Megamycete destabilizes the entire region, bringing the castle's role as an active experimentation site to a permanent end. Unlike Raccoon City's clean erasure by missile, Castle Dimitrescu's end is quieter, but no less complete. But if you think a single aristocratic death cult is disturbing, wait until you hear about the research facility built at the literal bottom of the world, Umbrella Antarctic Research Facility. Building a Baroque family shrine in Antarctica is objectively insane, and that's exactly what Umbrella did. The Antarctic facility isn't just a research lab dropped into the ice. It's a full cathedral to the Ashford family legacy, complete with portraits, statues, and cathedral-like halls, all buried beneath glacial formations at the literal end of the world. The logistics alone are absurd, transporting equipment, personnel, and structural materials to one of the most hostile environments on Earth, then carving tunnels through ice and rock to house cutting-edge bioorganic weapons research. Peak Umbrella arrogance. The facility's architecture layers industrial labs with family shrine spaces, creating temperature gradients that range from climate-controlled chambers to sections exposed to sub-zero Antarctic conditions. Walk into the wrong corridor and you freeze instantly. Creatures behave differently depending on the zone they're in. The entire complex is designed to weaponize the environment itself. And at the center of it all is Alexia Ashford, who in 1983 placed herself in cryogenic sleep for 15 years to fully bond with the T. Veronica virus. That's not a failed experiment or a desperate gamble. That's ultimate commitment to viral symbiosis. She willingly spent a decade and a half frozen in stasis, waiting for her body to fully integrate with a pathogen that would give her godlike control over organic matter. When she wakes up, the facility transforms. Veronica doesn't just infect organisms, it enables rapid plant-like proliferation. Vines erupt from walls, spores fill the air, chitinous growths sprout from infected personnel and fuse with machinery. Blood and vegetation merge with steel and circuitry, turning the facility into a living organism under Alexia's influence. The architecture itself becomes hostile, breathing and bleeding, and growing in ways that make navigation a nightmare. Claire and Chris Redfield arrive during the facility's final act. During the battles with Alexia, they trigger explosive cascades and structural failures across multiple sections. Ceilings collapse, ice caves give way. The cathedral-like halls are buried under falling debris and Antarctic landscape. By the time the Redfields escape, the facility is effectively entombed under ice and rubble with nature itself, serving as the primary containment barrier. The Ashford saga ends frozen, buried, and forgotten. A monument to bioorganic weapons hubris left to rot at the bottom of the world. But if you think a frozen lab in Antarctica is extreme, wait until you hear about the Spanish village where an entire community was enslaved by parasites and turned into a synchronized weapon, Los Iluminados Village. The Los Iluminados Village in rural Spain is something worse than a containment failure. An entire community deliberately enslaved by a parasitic cult and turned into a synchronized weapon. When Leon Kennedy arrived in 2004, he walked into a place where every farmhand had been converted into a ganado and every alley was a potential kill box. The transformation happens through Las Plagas, ancient parasitic organisms revived by cult leader Osmond Sadler. Unlike viruses that spread through bites or airborne contact, plagas are physically implanted into hosts, bonding with the nervous system to enable both enhancement and total mind control. The entire village population was systematically converted through deliberate implantation, not an accident, not a containment failure, a coordinated rollout. What makes it tactically horrifying is that ganados retain human intelligence. They wield weapons, coordinate ambushes, and communicate with each other. These aren't mindless zombies stumbling forward. They're farmers and villagers who still remember how to use a pitchfork or a chainsaw, just under complete cult control. Houses that once sheltered families become kill boxes. The central church becomes cult headquarters. Every building can be breached from multiple directions, turning exploration into a constant calculation of sightlines and escape routes. The most disturbing detail is what the village almost became. Ashley Graham's planned implantation would have carried plagas directly into the White House. A rural backwater, written off by the outside world, almost became the launching point for a parasitic infection with global reach. Leon kills Sadler and escapes. But there's no canonical cleanup operation shown, no missile strike, no international investigation on screen, just silence and a village left to rot in the Spanish countryside. Did the Spanish government quietly sterilize the region, or was it just forgotten? The series never confirms it either way, which is, not ideal. But if you think one enslaved village is disturbing, wait until you hear about what happens when an entire African city district gets turned into a live testing ground for parasites. Sheva's Kijuju Autonomous Zone. Kijuju is a heavily populated West African urban district. Thousands of people live there. In 2009, Tricell Corporation uses the entire place as a live petri dish for bioorganic weapons. And before you write this off as some isolated lab gone wrong, let me be clear. This was deliberate. Checkpoints, fences, armed patrols, the whole security theater wasn't there to keep people safe. It was there to keep outsiders away while Tricell ran experiments under the guise of quarantine operations. The pathogen distributed to the population is type 2 Las Plagas, a refined version of the parasite from Spain, but here's where it gets worse. Unlike the rural ganados in Spain, who stumbled around with pitchforks and chainsaws, Kijuju's Majini retain full tool use, communication, and coordinated tactics. They use firearms, they drive vehicles, they set ambushes with heavy weapons. An entire urban district of organized, armed, parasite-controlled residents. And that's not even the worst part. Tricell also uses Kijuju as a testing ground for Ouroboros, a virus-parasite hybrid that manifests as writhing black tendrils. It consumes biomass to form gigantic, amorphous monsters. Drop a sample on someone and watch them either become a living weapon or dissolve into meat. The entire region becomes a field test for both mass mind control and biomass-absorbing nightmare fuel. There's an uncomfortable, real-world echo here that's impossible to ignore. Medical exploitation in the Global South has a documented, horrifying history. Tricell takes that blueprint and runs it at industrial scale, turning civilians into test subjects under the cover of a security crisis. Thousands converted, thousands used. And by the time the BSAA intervenes, it's too late for most of them. Chris Redfield and Sheva Alomar eventually kill Albert Wesker by dropping him into an active volcano and detonating missiles, destroying the primary Ouroboros sample and inflicting heavy damage on Tricell's facilities. But the Majini are still out there. The Plaga remnants are still in the population. Kijuju doesn't get a clean missile strike like Raccoon City. It gets a messy, incomplete intervention, and then silence. At least Kijuju had some international response, unlike the quiet horror waiting in Tall Oaks. Tall Oaks. Raccoon City taught us that when a viral outbreak hits a modern American city, the government's preferred solution is to drop a missile on it and pretend the whole thing never happened. Tall Oaks, in 2013, proved that nobody learned a single thing from that disaster. Except this time, they made it worse on purpose. The outbreak begins at Ivy University during a presidential address. Someone deploys aerosolized C virus gas inside the venue, and within minutes, attendees start transforming. The President of the United States himself gets infected, bites a Secret Service agent, and becomes a zombie in front of his own security detail. The sitting Commander-in-Chief, dead and reanimated before the speech, even finishes. That's not just a biohazard event. That's the symbolic collapse of political order happening in real time. But here's where it gets worse. The C virus doesn't spread slowly through bites and bodily fluids like the old T virus. It's airborne, fast, and catastrophically efficient. Thousands of civilians across the Ivy University campus, lecture halls, laboratories, dormitories, all of it are infected or killed within hours. The streets jam with cars driven by people turning mid-traffic. Pileups block escape routes, fires spread. The entire urban infrastructure of a modern city collapses before emergency services can even coordinate a response. And the authorities' plan? Authorize a missile strike to sanitize the outbreak. A conventional strike designed to level the city and destroy the infection along with everything and everyone still inside it. It's not containment, it's annihilation, dressed up as public health policy. Whether that's incompetence, desperation, or deliberate malice is anyone's guess, but the result is identical either way. Tall Oaks is effectively lost. Survivors number in the dozens, maybe low hundreds at best. A functional American city with a university, a subway system, high-rises, shopping districts, all of it erased in less than a week. And unlike Raccoon City in 1998, this happens in 2013 with global media, smartphones, and social networks. The idea that you can cover up the destruction of an entire city in the age of instant communication is laughable, but somehow the world moves on. But if you thought one American city going dark was bad, wait until you see what happens when the C virus hits a megapolis with millions of people and no plan beyond hope. The protagonists kill the right people fast enough. Lanxiang, almost every location in Resident Evil ends in fire, erasure, or large-scale sterilization. But Lanxiang doesn't get that luxury. It's a coastal Chinese megapolis with millions of residents, gleaming skyscrapers, dense urban cores, nemesis and zero chance of being quietly buried. In 2013, it becomes the largest coordinated C virus attack in recorded history, turning an entire modern city into a televised bioorganic weapon demonstration. And the world can't look away. The C virus produces two nightmare tiers. Standard zombies flood the streets, but that's almost quaint at this point. The real problem is the Javo, intelligent mutants who retain enough cognitive function to wield firearms, pilot motorcycles, and adapt their own bodies mid-combat. Get shot, grow armor plating, lose a limb, sprout a tentacle cluster. They're not shambling, they're hunting. Then you add the massive bioorganic weapons like the Ogroman, 30F to bioorganic weapons that rampage through skyscraper canyons and smash elevated highways into rubble. This isn't a horror scenario anymore. It's a military siege. High-rise buildings become vertical death traps. Stairwells blocked by debris, elevators failing mid-climb, rooftop evacuations intercepted by airborne creatures. Players navigate collapsed skyscrapers tilting at dangerous angles where entire floors have sheared off and corporate architecture turns into vertical climbing puzzles. The slum districts are worse in different ways. Narrow alleys, rooftop mazes, stacked apartments where Javo flanked from 3 directions at once. Ports turn into logistical nightmares. Shipping containers stacked into improvised fortresses. Cranes toppling. Dock workers turn Javo coordinating with military precision. But here's the thing. Unlike Raccoon and Tall Oaks, Langxiang doesn't get erased by missile strike, partly because sanitizing a city this size would require multiple warheads and invite international catastrophe, partly because by 2013, anti-bioterror strategy has matured just enough to attempt containment instead of erasure. Chris Redfield and others hunt down the source, destroy production facilities, and kill the primary bioterror actors. Large sections of Langxiang are left in ruins, entire districts devastated, but the city itself survives. Casualties likely reach hundreds of thousands, and it's televised, globally witnessed, smartphone capture Javo executing civilians in the streets. News helicopters broadcast skyscraper collapses live. Social media spreads footage of Ogroman tearing through financial districts. The world can no longer pretend these are isolated accidents. This is biological warfare in a modern metropolis, streamed in real time to billions of viewers. So, how does civilization continue after that? How do governments explain that a Chinese megacity was turned into a war zone by engineered bioweapons? How does anyone board a plane, enter a subway, or trust that their government can protect them when Lan Xiang proved that a single coordinated C-virus deployment can collapse an entire modern city in hours? The series doesn't answer those questions. It just shows you the moment it all became impossible to ignore. Lan Xiang is the point where Resident Evil stops being horror and becomes history. Rights change the details. Captain Commando poster. Here's a fun exercise. Next time you boot up a Resident Evil game, stop sprinting toward the next objective and actually look at the walls, because Capcom has been decorating their horror environments with love letters to their own arcade catalog, and the Captain Commando poster is the perfect example. Captain Commando was a 4-player beat-em-up that launched in arcades back in 1991. The character himself rocks this over-the-top futuristic armor suit, all primary colors in sci-fi bravado. He was basically Capcom's mascot before the company realized they had better option, and his poster just exists in Resident Evil hanging on a wall somewhere in a public space, blending in with every other piece of background clutter like it belongs there. Zero interactivity, zero gameplay function. You can't pick it up, scan it, or trigger a secret cutscene where Captain Commando dropkicks a zombie. It's just a poster doing poster thing, which is exactly what makes it the perfect starting point because every reference we're about to cover falls somewhere on a spectrum. On one end, completely invisible background props that reward the 3 people who actually read the walls. On the other end, fully functional weapons and crossover events that fundamentally change how you play the game. The Captain Commando poster sits firmly at the invisible end. It's the kind of detail that makes you wonder how many other things you've walked past without a second glance, and the answer is a lot. But if you think a poster is a deep cut, wait until you see what Capcom did with an entire arcade cabinet. Star Gladiator, arcade cabinet. Now if you thought Captain Commando was obscure, buckle up because tucked into the background of certain Resident Evil environments is an arcade cabinet for Star Gladiator, and I can almost guarantee you've never heard of it. Star Gladiator was Capcom's 1996 3D fighting game set in a sci-fi universe featuring intergalactic warriors. It was Capcom's attempt to break into the 3D fighting space during the mid-90s arcade boom, and it actually pioneered some genuinely interesting mechanics that would influence later Capcom fighters. But here's the thing, almost nobody remembers it. The cabinet shows up blended into recreational spaces within RE's world, just sitting there like any other piece of background furniture. You can't play it. You can't interact with it in any meaningful way. At best, examining it might give you a minor audio cue. That's it. That's the whole reference, and there's something genuinely charming about that. Capcom essentially placed an advertisement for a game that 99% of their audience has never heard of in a location where 99% of players will never look closely enough to notice. It's like hiding a business card inside a wall during construction. Nobody's finding that. But someone at Capcom knew it was there, and that was enough. What makes this fun is what it implies about the RE universe. If a Star Gladiator cabinet exists in Raccoon City, then Capcom's games exist as entertainment media within the Resident Evil world. Somewhere in this zombie-infested hellscape, a kid was playing Star Gladiator before everything went sideways, which is, not ideal. But if you think a forgotten arcade cabinet is a deep cut, wait until you see where Strider Hiryu's emblem shows up. Strider Hiryu emblem. Here's something that makes zero sense on paper. Strider Hiryu is a cyborg ninja from the year 2048. He backflips off satellites, slices through robot dinosaurs, and moves like gravity personally offended him. Resident Evil is a game where you slowly open a door while something wet breathes on the back of your neck. These two franchises have absolutely nothing in common. And yet, Capcom went ahead and tucked Strider's geometric emblem into RE environments anyway. Walls, equipment, gear designs, just sitting there. A cybernetic ninja insignia chilling in a hallway full of biological nightmares. I don't know what to tell you. The emblem does nothing. Zero gameplay benefit. You can't interact with it. It doesn't unlock a secret. And it won't save you from the thing standing behind that door. It exists purely as a visual reward for the specific type of person who played a 1989 arcade game about a ninja fighting a Soviet grandmaster on a flying battleship, which is, a pretty narrow audience. But that's exactly how Capcom operate. They treat their games like a painter hides initials in a canvas. Little signatures stamped into the background, invisible unless you know what you're looking for. The Strider emblem is basically Capcom writing their name on the wall and daring you to notice. Here's the thing though, the emblem's visibility actually shifts depending on your region and platform. Some versions have it sitting in plain sight, others bury it deeper into the environment. So, depending on where you bought the game and what you're playing it on, you might have a completely different treasure hunt on your hands. But, if you think a ninja emblem hidden in a zombie game is a weird tonal clash, wait until you see what Capcom did with a literal sun goddess wolf, Okami. Here's the thing, Okami is possibly the most visually beautiful game Capcom has ever made. We're talking about a 2006 masterpiece with a Japanese inkwash art style that looks like a living painting. Amaterasu, the White Wolf sun goddess, uses a celestial paintbrush to restore life to a decaying world. And yet, despite being one of the most artistically ambitious games ever created, Capcom has never given it a proper Easter egg inside Resident Evil. That absence is actually kind of loud. Capcom loves hiding references to their own catalog inside Resident Evil games. Street Fighter, Mega Man, Devil May Cry, they all get nods. But Okami? Nothing. The White Wolf deity who literally paints the world back to life gets zero representation in the franchise that loves stuffing references into every corner of its environments, and it's not like Okami is forgotten by Capcom entirely. Amaterasu has shown up in Marvel vs. Capcom 3, appeared as a crossover in Monster Hunter, and even got an HD remaster in 2017. Capcom clearly knows the game has a passionate fan base. They just haven't bridged the gap between celestial inkwash mythology and real bioorganic weapon horror, which, fair enough, the aesthetic whiplash would be insane. Okami's entire visual identity is built on elegance, mythology, and artistic expression. Resident Evil is built on grimy decay, biological horror, and survival desperation. These two worlds have absolutely nothing in common except the Capcom logo. Maybe that's exactly why the crossover hasn't happened. Some things are too tonally different to smash together, even as a background prop. But honestly, a small Amaterasu figurine sitting on a dusty shelf in some save room would be perfect. Capcom, if you're listening, make it happen. At least Okami gets acknowledged somewhere in Capcom's crossover history, unlike the next reference, which is literally just a pair of underwear, Arthur's boxers. Up until now, every reference we've talked about has been something you walk past, a poster on a wall, a cabinet in the corner, something you notice, go, oh neat, and move on with your life. But Capcom decided that wasn't enough. They wanted you to stop looking at references and start wearing them. and they chose the most ridiculous possible outfit to kick that off. In select Resident Evil titles, you can unlock Arthur's boxer shorts from Ghosts and Goblins as a full cosmetic costume. Your protagonist strips down to nothing but red underwear and fights bioorganic weapons like that's a completely normal thing to do. For anyone who didn't grow up feeding quarters into arcade machines, here's the context. In the original 1985 Ghosts and Goblins, Arthur starts in full knight armor. Every time he takes a hit, a piece breaks off. Take enough damage, and the guy is literally battling demons in his boxers. It's one of the most iconic visual gags in gaming history, and it's been a running joke across Capcom titles for nearly 4 decades. Now, transplant that energy into Resident Evil. You're creeping through a dimly lit hallway. Something is growling behind a door. The music is building, and your character is standing there in bright red underwear like he just got locked out of his apartment. The tonal whiplash is genuinely incredible. There's a tyrant charging at you, and you look like you just rolled out of bed. The costume does absolutely nothing mechanically. 0 stat changes, 0 advantages. It exists purely to make the most terrifying moments in survival horror look completely absurd. And unlocking it isn't easy either. You typically need significant campaign completion or specific achievement milestones, which means you have to earn the right to look that stupid. But if running around in your underwear feels like peak Capcom absurdity, wait until you see what they did with a certain photojournalist, Frank West Photo. Frank West has covered wars, you know? He's also covered zombie outbreaks, mall sieges, and roughly 10,000 creative ways to kill the undead with a shopping cart and a lawnmower. So, naturally, Capcom decided he deserved a little acknowledgement inside their other zombie franchise, the one that takes itself considerably more seriously. Here's what makes this reference work so well. Frank West isn't just some random Capcom character shoved into a background. His entire identity revolves around photography. The guy's defining gameplay mechanic across the Dead Rising series is literally taking pictures of zombies, survivors, and everything in between. So when he shows up in Resident Evil through a photographic reference, it feels thematically earned rather than forced. A photographer being referenced through a photograph. Sometimes the simplest connections are the cleanest, but the real beauty here is the tonal contrast. Dead Rising is a franchise where you can duct tape a machete to a broom and call it a weapon, where you fight psychopaths dressed as clowns in a food court, where the zombie apocalypse is basically an excuse to commit creative retail violence. Resident Evil, meanwhile, treats its zombie outbreaks like genuine extinction-level biological catastrophes with government conspiracies, corporate espionage, and enough body horror to fill a medical textbook. These two franchises could not be more different in tone, and yet they share the same conceptual DNA. Zombies, survival, Capcom. The Frank West reference quietly acknowledges that connection without pretending these universes actually overlap. It's a wink, not a handshake. Nobody's suggesting Frank would last 5 minutes against a tyrant. He'd probably try to take a selfie with it and get folded in half, which is, not ideal. What elevates this beyond a simple Easter egg is that it bridges Capcom's 2 approaches to the same genre. One plays it straight, one plays it for laughs, and both are better for existing alongside each other. Frank documented the absurd. Resident Evil documents the terrifying. Same job, wildly different resumes. But if you think a photograph is a subtle way to connect franchises, wait until you see what happens when Capcom gets under your skin. Literally, under the skin. So up until now, every reference we've talked about has been something hidden inside Resident Evil. Another Capcom franchise sneaking into the horror game as a costume, a weapon, a poster on the wall. But this one flips the entire concept on its head. Because in 2004, Capcom took Resident Evil's most terrifying creation and dropped him into one of the goofiest games ever made. Under the Skin is a PlayStation 2 game where you play as a little alien named Cosme, who disguises himself as humans and pranks people to collect coins. It's cartoonish, it's colorful. It's the kind of game where you're turning people into frogs and stealing their lunch money. There is 0% chance you've heard of this game, unless you were the one specific kid at your local Blockbuster who grabbed the weird box art instead of GTA. But here's where it gets interesting. Under the Skin features a full Nemesis-themed level. That's right, the 8 FT tall bioweapon who spent all of Resident Evil 3 screaming "stars" and chasing Jill Valentine through Raccoon City shows up in a game about an alien doing pranks. he's adapted into Under the Skin's comedic gameplay systems, meaning Nemesis, the creature that traumatized an entire generation of horror fans, is now operating within the logic of a cartoon. It's like putting a great white shark in a ball pit. Technically, it fits. Emotionally, something has gone very wrong. What makes this reference genuinely notable is the direction. Capcom didn't just put other franchises into RE, they also pulled RE out and transplanted it into completely different genres. Nemesis in a comedy game proves that Capcom's cross-franchise philosophy wasn't a one-way street. It flowed wherever they felt like sending it, tone be damned. But if you think putting Nemesis in a comedy game is a strange crossover, wait until you hear about the franchise that shared actual DNA with Resident Evil from the very beginning, Dino Crisis. This one hurts, and I mean that genuinely. Regina from Dino Crisis shows up as a fully unlockable costume in certain Resident Evil titles, letting you swap your protagonist's look for her tactical military gear and play through the entire campaign dressed as a character from a franchise that Capcom has left to rot for over 20 years. You keep all your standard RE abilities and mechanics. Nothing changes gameplay-wise. You just look like Regina now, which is, not ideal for your emotional health if you're a Dino Crisis fan. Here's the thing. Dino Crisis launched in 1999 and shared so much DNA with Resident Evil that people literally called it Resident Evil with dinosaurs. Same survival horror framework, same resource management tension, same fixed camera angles in the original, same director and Shinji Mikami. These weren't distant cousins, they were sisters. Regina's appearance in RE isn't some random crossover pulled from the depths of Capcom's back catalog. It's a family reunion, one where only half the family is still alive. Unlocking the costume typically requires hitting specific completion milestones or achievement conditions. So, Capcom makes you work for it. They reward dedicated players with acknowledgement of a franchise that hasn't seen a new entry since Dino Crisis 3 in 2003. Let that sink in. 2 decades of silence. No remake, no reboot, no spiritual successor, just Regina showing up occasionally in someone else's game like a ghost at a dinner party. And that's what makes this reference simultaneously the most heartwarming and most frustrating one on this list. Capcom clearly remembers Dino Crisis exists. They put effort into recreating Regina's look. They tied it to achievement rewards. This isn't neglect through ignorance. This is a company looking directly at a beloved franchise, nodding, and then walking away. Every time Regina appears in an RE title, it's Capcom saying, "Yeah, we know," without ever saying, "And we're bringing her back." But if you think borrowed costumes from dormant franchises sting, wait until you see what happens when Capcom's biggest fighting game icons show up in a zombie apocalypse. Ryu and Chun-Li outfits. Street Fighter is the crown jewel. It's the franchise that put Capcom on the map, the one that basically invented competitive fighting games as we know them, and arguably the most recognizable gaming brand the company has ever produced. So, when Ryu's white GI and red headband show up as an unlockable costume in a Resident Evil title, that's not just a cute nod. That's Capcom deploying the big guns. And Chun-Li's right there with him. The blue chi-pow, the signature hair buns, the whole look. Both costumes have appeared across multiple RE titles, letting protagonists swap their tactical gear for full-on fighting game attire. Some titles made them available through seasonal events or promotional windows, with availability bouncing around depending on your platform and region, which is, not ideal if you're trying to collect everything. But here's what makes these costumes so uniquely entertaining. Ryu can shatter a car with his bare fists. He throws literal fireballs from his palms. Chun-Li can kick a man into the stratosphere. These are characters built around the fantasy of absolute physical dominance. They don't need weapons, they don't need healing items. They are the weapon, and then you put their outfits on a Resident Evil protagonist, and suddenly Ryu is crouching behind a dumpster, desperately mixing green herbs together, because a single zombie grabbed him funny. Chun-Li's signature spinning bird kick has been replaced with, "Please God, let me find shotgun shells." The contrast between Street Fighter's power fantasy and RE's vulnerability fantasy is genuinely hilarious. You look like you could roundhouse kick a tyrant through a wall. You cannot. You have 4 pistol rounds and a prayer. That's the magic of these costumes. They don't change how the game plays. They change how the game feels. You're wearing the skin of a world warrior while experiencing the exact opposite of what a world warrior would ever experience. It's Capcom's most iconic franchise meeting, its most hostile one. And the result is a character who looks like they should be winning a tournament, but is instead getting chased down a hallway by a man in a trench coat. But if Street Fighter represents Capcom's commercial peak, the next reference comes from a franchise born directly out of Resident Evil's own DNA, Dante's Legacy. Every other reference on this list is a wink, a costume here, a poster there, a fun little nod between franchises that exist in the same corporate family. This one is different. This one is a birth certificate. Devil May Cry started life as Resident Evil 4. That's not a fan theory. That's not speculation. That's documented Capcom development history. Hideki Kamiya was directing what was supposed to be the next mainline Resident Evil game, and during development, his vision kept drifting further and further from survival horror. The combat got faster, the protagonist got cooler, the enemies got more supernatural. At some point, Capcom looked at what Kamiya was building and basically said, "This is awesome, but this isn't Resident Evil." So they spun it off into its own franchise. Devil May Cry launched in 2001, and the rest is gaming history, which means every single time a Dante-inspired costume shows up in a Resident Evil game, every gothic leather coat, every supernatural weapon aesthetic, every visual nod to DMC's Baroque action style, Capcom isn't just referencing another franchise, they're referencing their own alternate timeline. They're pointing at a game that literally used to be the one you're playing right now. Here's the thing, this connection also explains something players have debated for years. When Resident Evil 4 finally did come out in 2005, it was dramatically more action-oriented than any previous entry. The camera pulled in closer, the combat got tighter, the pacing shifted toward intensity over atmosphere, and people wondered why. The answer is sitting right there in the development history. Resident Evil 4's DNA was already entangled with what became Devil May Cry. The action-focused design philosophy that birthed DMC didn't just disappear when Kamiya's project got reassigned. It bled back into the franchise it came from. That's what makes this the most meaningful reference on the entire list. It's not a crossover. It's not an Easter egg. It's a family tree. Two franchises that share literal developmental DNA. And every Dante reference in Resident Evil is Capcom quietly acknowledging that these two series were once the same game. One just chose demons, and the other chose zombies. But if you think shared DNA between two Capcom franchises is impressive, wait until you see what happened when Resident Evil crossed over with Monster Hunter World. Because that wasn't a costume. That was a full-scale event. In Monster Hunter World, every reference we've covered so far has been a visual nod. A costume here, a poster there, maybe a weapon if Capcom was feeling generous. Monster Hunter World said, "Forget all that," and built an entire boss fight. In November 2019, Capcom launched a limited-time collaborative event between Monster Hunter World's Iceborne expansion and the Resident Evil 2 remake. And this wasn't some lazy reskin job. They took the T-Zero, better known as Mr. X, one of the most iconic enemies in horror gaming history, and dropped it into Monster Hunter's hunting framework as a fully functional monster encounter with unique attack patterns, custom damage thresholds, and multiplayer scaling design for full hunting teams. Here's the thing. The Tyrant in Resident Evil is a creature you're supposed to run from. It's an unstoppable pursuer. The entire design philosophy is, you cannot kill this thing, so stop trying. Now, translate that into a game where the entire point is killing things cooperatively with oversized weapons. That's a fascinating design problem, and Capcom actually solved it. They had to rebuild the Tyrant's behavior from the ground up, giving it tells, windows, stagger states, all the mechanical language Monster Hunter players understand, while still making it feel like the relentless Nightmare RE fans recognized. The result was a boss that genuinely felt threatening, in a game where players routinely slap dragons around with guitars. But the event didn't stop at the fight itself. Players who completed the encounter earned Resident Evil-themed armor sets and weapon cosmetics, letting hunters permanently equip gear bearing RE's aesthetic long after the collaboration ended. Your character could walk around the Monster Hunter hub looking like they just crawled out of Raccoon City, which is, a fashion choice. The collaboration window lasted roughly 1 month. That's it. If you missed it, you missed it, and that urgency drove massive player engagement with hunters who'd never touched a Resident Evil game, suddenly learning about the franchise through a 20-minute boss fight. Capcom essentially turned a crossover event into a marketing campaign that players thanked them for. This was real development resources, real design work, real mechanical integration between two completely different gameplay philosophies. Not a costume swap, not a background poster. A full-scale collaborative event that required both franchises to meet in the middle. But even Monster Hunter World's fully developed boss encounter isn't the deepest Capcom has gone with cross-franchise integration, because one reference didn't just give you a fight to complete, it gave you a weapon to keep. The Mega Buster, every single reference we've covered so far has something in common. You look at it, you wear it, you notice it on a wall, or unlock it as a costume. They're all things that exist around you while you play Resident Evil. The Mega Buster is the one you shoot zombies with. In Dead Rising, Mega Man's iconic arm-mounted cannon is a fully functional, fully equipable weapon. Not a skin, not a reskin of an existing gun with a blue coat of paint. An actual weapon with its own firing behavior and damage output pulled directly from the Mega Man franchise. You aim the thing. It fires energy projectiles that deal real damage to whatever zombie horde is unfortunate enough to be standing in front of you, and Frank West gets the full Mega Man outfit to go with it, turning a photojournalist in a mall into a walking Capcom legacy tribute? Here's the thing. They don't just hand you this for showing up. Unlocking the Mega Buster requires defeating a massive number of zombies, meaning Capcom gated their ultimate crossover reward behind genuine dedication. You have to earn it. And when you finally get it, the weapon actually changes how you approach the game. Do you bring the Mega Buster into the fray, or stick with baseball bats and chainsaws? No other reference on this entire list creates anything close to that kind of choice. Mega Man debuted in 1987. The Mega Buster has been his defining weapon for nearly 4 decades, making it arguably the single most iconic piece of Capcom hardware ever created, and they transplanted it directly into a zombie action game where it functions as a genuine combat tool. The energy blast effects are faithful. The outfit is faithful. They adapted everything to fit Dead Rising's weapon framework without stripping away what makes it feel like the Mega Buster, and that's really what makes this the perfect ending point. Because when you zoom out and look at everything we've covered, from boxer shorts hidden in a menu to an arcade cabinet, nobody notices, to Street Fighter costumes to a full Monster Hunter collaboration event, they all come from the same impulse. Capcom loves its own history. Every poster, every costume swap, every limited time event, and every functional weapon pulled from a completely different franchise exists because somebody at that company looked at their back catalog and said, yeah, let's put that in there. The Mega Buster is just the purest expression of that instinct. Not a reference you observe, a legendary weapon you hold in your hands and fire at the undead. A 1987 arm cannon doing real work in a zombie-infested shopping mall. I don't know what to tell you. Capcom just built different endings, moved off-screen. The Spencer Mansion incident is often remembered as the night the heroes blew up the monster factory. The real story is a paperwork failure dressed as a victory. 4 people walk out of that forest with a first-hand account of corporate engineered horror, and the company they're accusing walks away completely intact. It's 1998, and the timeline starts ticking tonight. Jill Valentine and Chris Redfield make it out of the mansion. So do Rebecca Chambers and Barry Burton. The lineup fans settled on after years of arguing over the game's multiple endings. The mansion has more branching outcomes than a choose-your-own-adventure book, but the surviving 4 became the version most of the fan base accepted as canon. The self-destruct sequence goes off right before they clear the grounds, and the timing is the point. The survivors torch the lab notes, the mutants, and the reanimated test subjects wandering the basement on their way out, doing Umbrella's cleanup for free. Efficient, if you squint. What's left afterward is 4 traumatized witnesses and 0 physical proof, since the mansion and the samples went up with everything else. Leaving personal accounts nobody official has to believe. Umbrella's own copies of the research survive untouched, filed somewhere that never caught fire. That's exactly the kind of evidence a corporation with lawyers and a Sear police budget knows how to bury. Jill and Chris carry that story into a department, with every incentive to file it and forget it, and they'll spend years watching that silence cost everyone else who isn't them. A cover-up holds fine when the evidence is one building on one mountain. Within weeks, the evidence had a population of 100,000, a working sewer system, and it was walking down public streets in broad daylight in front of people holding cameras. Resident Evil 2. By October 1998, the United States erased one of its own cities in under an afternoon. One afternoon. Call it containment. Most readings call it the erasure of a corporate secret, too. 2 months earlier, the mansion cover-up meant torching one house and hoping a handful of survivors stayed quiet. Raccoon City scales that logic to 100,000 civilians, infected block by block, overwhelming police and the military alike. A haunted house with a body count becomes a metropolitan area collapsing on the evening news with a corporation's name attached to the cause. Leon S. Kennedy starts his first day on the force and finds a city eating itself. Claire Redfield arrives looking for her missing brother and finds the same thing. Neither signed up for a viral apocalypse, and both survive it, carrying Raccoon City into their missions for years to come. Washington's answer is a missile. Rather than risk the infection crossing city limits, the government levels Raccoon City, killing everyone inside. Umbrella takes the hit. Its labs are gone and its name becomes shorthand for corporate poison, yet the company fights on in courtrooms and boardrooms. A missile erases a whole city and the stock ticker does not even flinch. Fans still argue over whether this game or its follow-up marks the outbreak's true end, and most timelines award that final chapter to the sequel, one where the streets outside are still crawling. Jill and Chris walked out of a mansion with a story their own department buried. Raccoon City hands investigators 100,000 death certificates and a crater nobody can explain away. A much harder thing to bury. Erasing a city still leaves a paperwork problem. The handful of people who signed reports about that mountain are alive somewhere, and something was engineered to walk through streets and find them by name. Resident Evil 3. Nemesis. Umbrella built a weapon with exactly one job: erase the last people who could testify about what happened in that mansion. Jill Valentine survived it anyway. That survival cost her a city. October 1998. Jill gets out of Raccoon City with hours to spare, and the United States government makes a call nobody in this franchise had made yet. Skip containment, erase the address from the map. A missile finishes what the mansion fire couldn't a few months earlier. 100,000 people gone along with the paperwork. Umbrella built Nemesis to hunt a short list. The surviving STARS members who walked out of that mansion, carrying a story their department wanted buried. Jill and Brad Vickers sit at the top of it. Efficient hiring practice for a pharmaceutical company. And I say that as a guy who's organized events by vibes in a group chat. Then the government's decision reframes the whole problem. Umbrella spent 2 games quietly erasing witnesses one at a time. Washington skips the subtlety and erases the witnesses, the evidence, and the city block by block from the air. The mansion cover-up that started with one torched estate just picked up a national budget. Some fans will argue over which one carries the heavier ending. That argument skips past which game actually shows you the crater. This one. Jill walks away breathing. Raccoon City doesn't. That trade becomes the template that defines the series from here on out. A missile is thorough about one zip code and useless everywhere else on Earth. The family that built Umbrella had held property far outside that blast radius for generations, and somebody was already boarding a flight toward one of those addresses chasing a single person who'd gone missing there. Resident Evil code, Veronica, 15 years. That's how long Alexia Ashford sat frozen in a private stasis chamber, perfecting a virus while Raccoon City still believed it was dealing with a local outbreak it could contain. Claire Redfield doesn't know any of that. She's just looking for her brother. She gets arrested infiltrating an Umbrella facility, shipped to a prison island off South America, and dropped straight into a family business that makes the city she just escaped look like a rounding error. Umbrella up to this point reads like an American pharmaceutical company that lost control of one branch office. Code. Veronica throws that out. The Ashford estate runs its own labs, its own private army, its own bloodline of heirs bred and groomed for genetic research operating on an island and later in an Antarctic facility that has nothing to do with Raccoon City and never needed it. Alfred Ashford dresses in his dead sister's clothes and talks to a wax figure like she's still alive, which is one way to grieve. Alexia wakes from stasis 15 years older on paper and completely unaged in the mirror. Chris Redfield lands separately hunting the same company from the outside, and the siblings end up standing in the wreckage of a facility that was doing this work long before their hometown had a reason to be famous. The missile that flattened Raccoon City didn't touch any of it. That decision reads like the company trimming a branch to protect the tree. The same tree Jill and Chris tried to expose back in a mansion nobody believed them about. Claire gets her brother back. What she gets alongside him is proof that the war just got a lot bigger than one city. One report, one buried police file. Fans call this one of the most consequential entries in a game that gets far less mainstream attention than it deserves, and the ending backs that up. Claire and Chris walk out organized, hunting the company instead of running from it. Chasing the family across the map drags the question backwards instead of forwards. Everything inside that mansion was already moving the night before on the same mountain, and one survivor of that night walked straight into the story everyone thinks they already know from the beginning. Resident Evil 0. Forget Chris Redfield or Jill Valentine. The first hostage of the Resident Evil timeline is a rookie medic named Rebecca Chambers, and she survives 2 collapsing Umbrella sites in the same week before the mansion opens its doors. Worst resume booster ever? The Ecliptic Express looks like a routine transport, though nothing on record confirms that, and it turns into a slaughterhouse on rails. Rebecca escapes by running into a training facility built as an executive school and later repurposed for biological weapons testing on a captive population, and that facility burns too. It looks like Umbrella already had a system in place for disasters like this, trains and labs waiting to be discovered long before Raccoon City made the news. You could call that playing dumb while running something very deliberate. Billy Cohen walks out of that facility, a convicted killer who helped her survive it. And the franchise barely writes about him again. If his paperwork trail died with the people who could have filed it, that would explain why. Those officers and scientists likely didn't survive the outbreak either. Nothing since has confirmed where he goes or what he becomes. So, his fate stays exactly where the evidence left it, open. Rebecca does survive, and that survival is the entire point. She walks off one ruined Umbrella site and directly toward the Spencer Mansion, where she rejoins what's left of Bravo Team, which is precisely where Resident Evil 1 begins. The company's testing network turns out to be a habit, and she's living proof the pattern was running before anyone in Raccoon City noticed. Quite the resume update. Every collapsed site so far shares one name on the deed. A single company folding under its own secret sounds like a problem you could shut down until the next outbreak arrives, wearing no corporate logo at all. And whatever is steering those villagers was never manufactured in a lab. Resident Evil 4. A cult that answers to nobody made Chris and Claire's years of burning down Umbrella look like they were aimed at the wrong target. Los Illuminados runs on its own authority and its own funding, and it never asked Umbrella for permission to exist. Leon S. Kennedy walks into a remote Spanish village looking for one kidnapped president's daughter and finds an entire congregation carrying a parasites that spreads through the nervous system instead of the bloodstream. A worse commute than he signed up for. Las Plagas is the escalation that flipped the whole model on its head. The parasite keeps its host walking, talking, and passing as a normal person, and it decides on its own when that person needs to attack. Villagers go about their day looking exactly like villagers until the voice in their skull gives the order. Ashley Graham comes out of that compound alive. Leon refuses to linger in the cult's territory, and the operation blows Los Illuminados and its Las Plagas pipeline wide open. That survival keeps Leon inside active government service, and he eventually leads American bioterror operations. Ada Wong walks out of the same collapsing operation carrying something in her bag, and she leaves with her actual agenda exactly where it started, unexplained. She gets to keep it that way, and nobody in the room stops her. Fans still argue over whether this is the best action horror game the franchise ever built, an argument that runs alongside the claim that this is where the series traded horror for a rocket launcher. If you squint, both debates are describing the same turn, from a mansion full of the infected dead to a village full of the infected living. A parasite still needs a body to steer, and a body can be shot. Somewhere ahead is a flooded farmhouse where the infection has no single skull to aim at because it grows underneath the property, like a root system, and the family living on top of it might as well be this season's fruit. Resident Evil 7. Biohazard Ethan Winters walks out of a burning farmhouse and doesn't know he just became the fourth name on an invoice that started in a mansion outside Raccoon City in 1998. That invoice has one line item every time. Burn the site, keep the sample. Spencer Mansion got a fire. Raccoon City got a missile. The Baker property gets flames, too. Except this time, the thing catching fire is only the visible part of the problem, the part that happens to have a roof over it. The Baker family's rot, the crawling shapes in the walls, the videotapes of relatives losing their minds one at a time, all of it traces back to the mold, a fungal growth spreading under the estate that traces to the Megamycete, working through the family's blood and the property's groundwater before Ethan's car broke down outside Dulvey, Louisiana. Umbrella scientists spent decades chasing viruses that needed a host and a syringe. The mold spreads by contact, by inheritance, by proximity, and it keeps operating people who are technically already dead. That is the scale that earlier cleanups never faced. An organism networked through groundwater and inheritance. A city can be leveled, a lab can be sealed, a mansion can burn to its foundation and take the evidence with it. An organism that treats the building above it as scaffolding rather than storage does not care which of those happens, and the game's ending confirms. The infection reaches well past the farmhouse walls, into a research effort that outlives the family entirely. Resident Evil 7 also drags the series back into a house, a flashlight, and a door nobody wants to open, undoing an entire action movie, decade in one deliberate swing. Fans still argue whether that counts as survival horror reborn or survival horror cosplaying in a new engine. Either way, Ethan drove to Louisiana for one person and left his evidence in a file that traces back through a burned lab, a destroyed city, and a mansion. A handful of investigators barely escaped alive. Every fire in this story was lit to end something. In a flooded Louisiana cellar, the root system just kept growing back. Fear changed with design. Somebody had to be last. And Resident Evil 6 earned this spot with the enthusiasm of a game actively trying to be anything other than survival horror. Released in 2012 with 4 entire campaigns, not one of them seemed interested in scaring you. The ammo economy alone tells the story. Earlier games made you count every bullet like your life depended on it. Resident Evil 6 hands you ammunition, like candy at a parade. Vulnerability? Gone. Leon's campaign actually tries for about 15 minutes, deliberately echoing the original mansion setup. You can squint and see a horror game in there somewhere. Then the Javos show up. These enemies mutate into increasingly ridiculous sci-fi creatures that look more like rejected anime villains than biological nightmares. The camera pulls back, movement speed cranks up, and the melee system gives you so much combat agency, you're basically an action hero wearing a horror game skin. Chris punched a boulder in Resident Evil 5, and Resident Evil 6 said, "Hold my herb." Action movie. Absolute 0 on the fear scale. But at least Resident Evil 6 knows what it is. The next entry genuinely thinks it's still a horror game, and that's almost worse. Resident Evil 5. Here's the thing about horror. It needs one ingredient above everything else. Not monsters, not gore, not even darkness. It needs isolation. The feeling that nobody is coming to help you. Resident Evil 5 looked at that concept and said, "Nah, have a friend." The mandatory co-op partner, whether AI-controlled Sheva or an actual human sitting next to you, fundamentally breaks the psychological equation that makes horror work. You can't feel vulnerable when someone is watching your back, healing you when you go down, and splitting ammo like you're at a buddy cop picnic. Every encounter becomes a tactical problem instead of a survival crisis. Then there's the setting. Chris Redfield's African campaign takes place in broad daylight for roughly 60% of its encounters, clear sight lines. You can see everything coming from a mile away, which is, not ideal for a horror game. And look, over 13 million copies sold. Commercially it's a monster, but that success cemented an action identity that fans still point to as the franchise's rock bottom for actual scares. Not the worst game, just the least scary one that still remembers it used to be horror. But at least Resident Evil 5 had the excuse of being a product of its era. The next entry on this list doesn't have that luxury. Resident Evil 3 Remake. Here's the thing about Resident Evil 3 Remake. It's not that Nemesis isn't scary. A 9FT bioweapon sprinting at you while screaming stars should be terrifying, but the game hands you so many tools to deal with him that the fear has an expiration date. You've got the dodge mechanic, explosive barrels scattered around like party favors, and enough ammo to open a small gun shop. Nemesis shows up across numerous encounters throughout the game, and after the first handful, you're not running from him. You're kiting him into environmental hazards like he's a particularly aggressive dog chasing the same tennis ball. The urban setting doesn't help either. Wide streets give you room to breathe, and room to breathe is the enemy of horror. The night sequences do pull their weight, cutting visibility and forcing genuine tension, but they're moments, not the experience. Then there's the runtime. At 7.8 hours average, you barely have time to settle into sustained dread before the credits roll. Terror needs time to marinate, and this game is serving you a steak that's been on the grill for 45 seconds. The scares come in bursts, intense, well-crafted bursts, but you feel empowered more than helpless, and empowerment is the opposite of horror. But if you think having too many tools ruins the tension, wait until we talk about the game that turned combat itself into an art form, and somehow still managed to be unsettling. Resident Evil 4. Here's where things get interesting, because Resident Evil 4 fundamentally changed how third-person games work forever, and in doing so, it may have accidentally murdered survival horror. You're in a cabin surrounded by ganados, then you hear it. 3 seconds of chainsaw revving before a burlap sack-wearing maniac splinters through the door and removes your head from your shoulders. That's sound design philosophy. Hearing the threat before you see it. It's pure horror DNA. It doesn't matter that the game gives you a shotgun and roundhouse kicks. In that moment, you are prey. The enemy variety is relentless. Ganados, Zealots, Plagas Mutations, El Gigante, Novistadors, Regeneradors. Each encounter messes with you differently. The Garrador fight forces you into a tight space with a blind, armored enemy that reacts to sound, turning a simple boss into a claustrophobic nightmare where every footstep could get you impaled. That's not action game design. That's horror direction wearing an action game skin. Here's the thing though. This game has a 96 on Metacritic, near universal acclaim. But the conversation always circles back to one question. Did Resident Evil 4 save the franchise or kill the genre? Because every action horror game that came after, including Resident Evil 5 and 6, pointed directly at this game and said, "See, they did it first," which is, not ideal for horror fans. But if you think the original handled that balance carefully, wait until you see what Capcom did with 19 years of hindsight. Resident Evil 4 Remake. Here's the thing about the original Resident Evil 4. It was terrifying in 2005, but not because of atmosphere. It was terrifying because a guy with a chainsaw could one-shot you, and the controls felt like steering a shopping cart through mud. The horror came from mechanical vulnerability, not psychological dread. The 2023 remake fixes that. And by fixes, I mean, it actually makes the game scary for the right reasons. Capcom rebuilt the entire visual pipeline with photorealistic lighting that plunges environments into genuine darkness. The village isn't just a combat arena anymore. It's a place where shadows move wrong and doorways feel like threats. The sound design alone transforms the experience operating at a fidelity that 2005 hardware couldn't dream of achieving. But here's where it gets interesting. The enemy AI is fundamentally more aggressive and less predictable. Ganados flank, coordinate, and vary their timing in ways the original never attempted. You genuinely don't know when one is going to lunge versus circle behind you, versus just stare at you from across the room. That uncertainty is horror. Predictability is comfort. The Chainsaw Man encounter got a complete psychological overhaul. The audio layers in the rev of the chainsaw at varying distances, growing louder as he closes in. Your brain registers the sound before you see him. By the time he's visible, your fight or flight response is already spiking. That's precision manipulation. Puzzle design forces you to stand still in dangerous rooms while your peripheral vision catches things moving. Darkness creeps in where it wasn't before. Your safe space isn't safe anymore. Same game structure, completely different fear response. But if the remake proved that modern tech can inject horror into action design, the next entry tried something even more ambitious with that same philosophy. Resident Evil Village. Resident Evil Village has a split personality problem, and I don't mean Lady Dimitrescu's mood swings. This is genuinely two different games stitched together wearing a trench coat and pretending to be one cohesive experience. Here's the thing. The vast majority of Village is a gothic action-adventure game. You're blasting lichens, exploring castles, fighting giant fish monsters. It's fun. It's gorgeous. It is not scary. You have more ammo than a small militia and the confidence of a man who's already killed a swamp monster made of fungus. But then you walk into House Beneviento. Your weapons disappear. The lights go out. Donna Beneviento's COD-DOH mutation has filled the estate with hallucinogenic flowers, warping Ethan's perception of reality the moment he steps inside. The house strips away every tool you've relied on and replaces combat with helplessness. Then comes the baby. A grotesque fetus monster stalks you through narrow corridors, accompanied by audio design specifically built to manipulate your anticipation. Its design is calculated cruelty, recognizable infant features fused with something from the bottom of a drain. Your brain simultaneously wants to protect it and run from it. That's not accidental. That's exploiting millions of years of caregiving instinct and then violating it. House Beneviento is cited by players as the scariest section in the entire game, and honestly, the people who disagree probably skipped it. But one section of brilliance doesn't carry an entire ranking, which is why Village lands here instead of higher. At least Village committed to its horror for one unforgettable stretch. The next game on this list couldn't even manage that. Resident Evil 0. Nobody talks about this game, and honestly, that's a crime, because Resident Evil 0 might have the single best horror setting in the entire franchise. A train, a moving claustrophobic metal coffin hurtling through the night with no way off. Here's the thing about the Ecliptic Express, you can't leave. Every other Resident Evil game gives you the psychological comfort of theoretically being able to walk out a door. Not here. You're trapped in narrow corridors with fixed camera angles, creating constant blind spots where something horrible can lunge at you from off-screen. The train rocks, the lights flicker, and you can hear things moving in the next car, but you cannot see them. But the real tension comes from a mechanic nobody else in the series ever attempted. You're controlling 2 characters with 6 shared inventory slots. 6. That's not resource management. That's resource starvation. Every single healing item you pick up means leaving something else behind. Every bullet Rebecca carries is a bullet Billy doesn't have. You're constantly doing mental math about who's more likely to die in the next room, and the answer is always both of them. The leech-filled train corridors where Capcom showed their hand, jump scares triggered by specific player movements one after another, they mapped exactly where you'd walk, exactly when you'd feel safe, and they punished you for it every single time. It's methodical, surgical, almost mean, and that's just the train. The game hasn't even reached the training facility yet, but if you think being trapped on a train with leeches is bad, wait until you meet something that actively hunts you through an entire building with no way to kill it. Resident Evil 3, Nemesis. Here's the thing about Nemesis, he's not smart. The AI running this 8-effort bioweapon operates across behavioral states that track your movement and create what feels like intelligent stalking. Players who dig into the actual mechanics discover predetermined patrol routes, exploitable patterns, and scripted triggers you can manipulate once you know the system, and none of that matters, not even a little bit, because in 1999, when that thing burst through a wall for the first time, nobody was thinking about behavioral states, they were thinking about survival. The psychological weight of Nemesis existing in the same space as you transforms every room into a potential ambush site. You're not fighting an AI, you're fighting the idea of an AI, and the idea is way scarier than the reality. But here's where it gets genuinely revolutionary. Resident Evil 3 had save rooms scattered across Raccoon City. Sounds generous, except Nemesis can follow you through doors and ambush you in areas you'd normally consider safe, shattering the one sacred guarantee the franchise had offered. Safe rooms meant safe. That was the deal. Nemesis looked at the deal, said no thanks, and kicked the door down. Then you've got the live selection system. Split-second decisions forcing fight or flight with barely any reaction time. You're layering mechanical panic on top of environmental dread, on top of the constant knowledge that this thing is somewhere behind you, following a route you can't see. The urban setting helps, too. Previous games trapped you in mansions and labs. Raccoon City is open. More space should mean more safety. Instead, it just means more directions Nemesis can come from, but at least Nemesis follows rules, even if you can't always see them. The next game in our ranking abandons that courtesy entirely. Resident Evil Code Veronica. Here's something nobody really thinks about when ranking these games. Every other Resident Evil gives you the illusion of escape. Raccoon City has roads out. The mansion has a front door, code. Veronica takes that away completely. You're on an island, then you're in Antarctica. There is literally nowhere to go. The ocean surrounds you in every direction, and that geographic helplessness sits in the back of your brain the entire time. This low hum of dread that urban settings simply cannot replicate. But the isolation is just the foundation. Fixed camera angles mean you're functionally blind around every corner and doorway. The game is riddled with blind spots that turn routine navigation into a potential death sentence. And unlike later entries with over-the-shoulder perspectives, Code. Veronica forces you to walk into darkness on faith alone. Then there's the lighter. The game requires an actual inventory slot just to see in certain areas. You're burning a resource on the ability to not die in the dark, which is, not ideal. Resource scarcity compounds everything. You're splitting items between Claire and Chris across 2 separate campaigns, making decisions that can soft lock your run hours later. Every bullet Claire uses is one Chris won't have. Every herb you burn through now is one you'll desperately need in Antarctica. The game punishes hesitation and generosity equally. Geographic hopelessness, visual vulnerability, darkness as a mechanical threat, and resource management that turns every pickup into a crisis. Code. Veronica layers all 4 simultaneously and never lets up. But if you think isolated vulnerability is scary, wait until you see what happens when Capcom rebuilt the RPD from the ground up with modern technology. Resident Evil 2 Remake. Here's the thing about Mr. X. He's not the first stalker enemy in Resident Evil, he's not even the most mechanically complex, but he might be the most terrifying, and it comes down to something nobody talks about enough: his shadow. The Resident Evil 2 Remake uses dynamic lighting that turns the entire Raccoon City Police Department into a warning system you never asked for. Mr. X's trench coat casts distinctive shadow patterns on walls before he rounds a corner. You see that silhouette stretch across the hallway and your stomach drops. You know exactly what's coming. The anticipation is worse than the encounter, and it's not just visual. The real killer is directional audio. His footsteps thud above you, below you, getting closer, getting farther, then closer again. Your brain builds a mental map of where he is at all times, which sounds like it should reduce fear, but it does the exact opposite. You're constantly aware of a thing that wants to kill you. That's not comfort, that's torture. Now throw in 8 inventory slots. That's it, 8. You're solving puzzles across this station while a 7FNE monster with unpredictable eye patrol patterns stalks you through both scenarios. Every time you open your inventory to combine herbs or swap a key item, he's still walking, still hunting. The 2-sense warning system, shadow plus footsteps, creates a paradox most horror games never achieve. Knowing the threat is coming makes it worse, not better. You're never surprised by Mr. X. You're perpetually dreading him, and dread is so much harder to shake than a jump scare. But if you think a single unstoppable stalker is peak Resident Evil horror, wait until we go back to where it all started, where the real terror was never a monster at all. Resident Evil. Here's the thing about the original Resident Evil. It wasn't trying to be the scariest game ever made. It was trying to be a game that worked on a PlayStation in 1996, and through sheer technical limitation, it accidentally created the most effective horror framework in gaming history. The fixed camera angles weren't an artistic choice, they were a hardware necessity. But what they created were dozens of blind spots throughout the Spencer mansion where anything could be waiting for you. You'd walk through a door, the camera would cut to a new angle, and suddenly there's a zombie 3F from your face. Every room transition became a dice roll with your life. Tank controls weren't designed to make you feel helpless. They existed because analog sticks weren't standard yet. But the result was a character who moved like they were wading through cement while threats closed in from angles you couldn't see. You couldn't just flick a stick and dodge. You had to commit, turn, align, move. By the time you'd repositioned, whatever was chasing you had already closed the gap. Then there's the bullet economy, 7 shells left, 2 zombies in the east corridor, 1 hunter somewhere near the save room. Do you fight or do you run and pray? Every other horror game since has tried to replicate that resource scarcity, and none of them have nailed it this completely. The mansion itself operates on rat in a maze psychology, limited visibility, doors that could lead to safety or to something that kills you in 2 hits. Modern games give you precision aiming, dodge buttons, responsive movement. All of that comfort erases the specific vulnerability that made this game burrow into people's heads. Decades of deliberate horror design have struggled to recreate what 1996 hardware constraints produced by accident, which is either poetic or deeply frustrating, depending on how you look at it. But if the original proved that helplessness is the foundation of true horror, the next entry took that principle and cranked it to a level that made grown adults refuse to play alone. Resident Evil 7, Biohazard. Every other game on this list showed you a character in danger. You watched Leon get chased. You watched Jill get stalked. You were always observing horror from a safe distance, like watching someone else's nightmare through a window. Resident Evil 7 shattered that window and shoved you inside. The first-person perspective isn't a gimmick. It's the single most important design decision in this franchise's history. The camera becomes your eyes. The Baker Plantation becomes your prison. Jack's footsteps land behind your head, and your brain, the stupid lizard part of it that can't tell the difference between a game and reality, starts firing survival responses like, you're actually trapped in a house with a family of cannibals. Here's the thing. The Baker family stalks you relentlessly across this plantation, showing up when you least expect it, turning every hallway into a potential ambush. The sound design is layered with hundreds of unique atmospheric audio cues, which is clinically insane levels of detail for a game about a man who can reattach his own hand. Your inventory holds 6 slots. 6! The franchise's most extreme resource scarcity happening while someone is actively trying to cave your skull in with a shovel. And then there's VR. The dinner sequence in VR has made grown adults physically recoil from their television sets. Jack Baker's pursuit in VR approaches genuine psychological distress. Players don't just feel scared, they feel trapped. That's not entertainment anymore. That's a hostage situation you paid $60 for. Sales exceeded 10 million units. Critics widely praise the perspective shift as a bold reinvention of the series. Turns out when you stop showing people horror and start making them live inside it, they can't look away. That's the difference. Observed horror is a haunted house. Embodied horror is waking up and realizing you live there,